The stream of people coming in has abated, and why don't we kick this off? This is the Duxbury Beach Reservation Community Forum relative to access and use of the Duxbury Beach. And I'm Wayne Dennison. I was asked to moderate this event tonight. I do not work for the DBR. I think I've been asked to moderate this event largely because I've probably run 100 public hearings in this town, and there's yet to be a casualty at any one of them. But it's my privilege to do this. I'm going to talk a little bit about format, and one of the first things that people asked me even in the hall was, are we going to get a chance to ask questions? And the answer to that is unequivocally yes. The purpose of this is that the Duxbury Beach Reservation brought all the parties involved with Duxbury Beach management together in front of this community to ensure access to accurate information as to how the beach is regulated and managed. And in order to do that, we have a number of panels who are going to give brief presentations. Probably, all told, we'll spend the first hour with the presentation by the panels, and we'll reserve about an hour and a half for questions. And with respect to the format of the questions, there will be microphones in the back. We'll do this largely like we do town meeting. We'll line up. You can ask your question. I'm going to ask. I understand that from time to time, people need to provide some factual background in order to ask a question, but ultimately, we're not looking for speeches here. What we're hoping to do is have a community forum where people ask questions, and so we're going to do it one at a time. If you want to ask more than one question, you're going to have to go stand in the back of the line again, but there are a number of individuals here to answer questions and who will provide information relative to the beach and how it's regulated and used. So let me start with introducing those folk. We have Carolyn Mostello she is a coastal waterbird biologist with the Massachusetts Division of Fisheries and Wildlife. And at some point, I don't know when, she will be joined by David Simmons, who's the supervisor of the Endangered Species Program at U.S. Fish and Wildlife. David indicates that every time he looks at his ways, he's farther away from Duxbury than he started. From the town of Duxbury, we have Steve Studley, who's the Recreation Director, and Rainey Reed, whom everybody knows is the town manager. And we have a number of people from the Duxbury Beach Reservation, Chris Lattazzi, who's the executive director, Clark Hinckley, who's the president, Sue Rourke, the treasurer, and Andre Martini, who's a director. The way this will begin is that we're going to do presentations from the panels. At the conclusion of those, we'll open it up for questions. I would ask that the questions be generally directed to me or to a panel as opposed to a specific individual. The goal here, and I'm sure we will achieve it, is a robust and respectful discussion of the issues around a beach that I suspect everybody in this room loves. So with those as an opening remark, why don't I first turn it over to our friends, the state and federal regulators, Carolyn Mostello.
Okay. Oh, good, this is on. So thanks for coming. Again, I'm Carolyn Mostello. I'm from the Massachusetts Division of Fisheries and Wildlife. So we are the state, the folks from the state who are working with wildlife. And David Simmons from U.S. Fish and Wildlife is the federal representative, and he should be here shortly. So my role today is really to give you some background on the birds and the regulations and a special permit that the state has called the Habitat Conservation Plan permit, so that everyone has that background information and can be on sort of equal footing going into the more detailed discussions. All right, so there are two species I want to touch on today that are found on Duxbury Beach. And they're rare species in the sense that they're listed, but they're the most widespread of our beach nesting birds that are listed. And that's the piping plover and the least tern. So the piping plover has a federal listing designation as threatened. And it has that same designation in Massachusetts as well. So I want to note that whatever the federal designation is, in Massachusetts, we're required to have the same or a more imperiled designation. So we can't list the species at anything less than threatened in Massachusetts because federally it's listed as threatened. So the least tern, or our population here at least, is not federally listed, but it is state listed as special concern. So in the state we have endangered, threatened, and special concern, and all of those designations are covered by the Massachusetts Endangered Species Act. So the piping plover and the least tern have very similar ecology. They choose almost the exact type of habitat to nest on. But there are a number of differences. So piping plovers are in the shorebird group, and they make their living on the shore. So they feed on the shore. They take marine invertebrates as their main food. And then the least tern is a seabird. It makes its living from the ocean. It feeds primarily on fish. And it doesn't feed on the beach. It simply nests and rests on the beach. So the chick mobility is linked to whether or not the chicks can feed themselves. So piping plover chicks, they hatch out, they're almost immediately mobile, and they range really widely across the beach because they're taking their food from the beach. So you'll see them all the way from the dunes to the ocean to the bayside and so forth. So least tern chicks cannot feed themselves because they can't fly, and the adults need to fly over the ocean to bring them food. And those chicks are also mobile. They tend to be a little less mobile than piping plover chicks, but they will move quite a distance from the nest, especially in response to disturbance. But their parents feed them on the beach until they're ready to fledge. And for both piping plovers and least terns, they're on the beach for about a month before they can fly. So both of the species experience similar threats. After all, they're nesting in the exact same habitat and they overlap. So those threats led to severely reduced populations. And the main threats were hunting, loss and degradation of habitat, disturbance by humans and pets, and destruction of eggs and chicks by vehicles. So hunting is not an issue in the Northeast anymore. This isn't something that's impacting our populations. But the rest of those threats are still remain threats, and we're still actively trying to manage those threats. And then an additional stressor on the populations now is climate change. We're seeing these increasing storms, storm frequencies, increasing severity of storms, and so forth, sea level rise, and all of these things are threats to the populations. They're going to be changing the nesting habitat for these birds, making the nesting habitat lower and shorter and less resilient to change. So I briefly just want to mention the relevant laws and policies that underlie our regulation and management of these birds. So first is the U.S. Endangered Species Act, and it prohibits take. And you'll hear that word multiple times throughout my presentation. So take is defined as harm, harassment, mortality, injury, and so forth. And it's the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that administers the regulations associated with the Endangered Species Act. Massachusetts has a parallel act called the Massachusetts Endangered Species Act. Its relevance is basically the same as the Endangered Species Act. And my agency, the Massachusetts Division of Fisheries and Wildlife, is the regulatory authority there. We also in Massachusetts have a very strong Wetlands Protection Act, and that act prohibits short and long-term impacts on rare species habitat. So those rare species that nest in wetlands habitats like piping plovers and least terns do. And the regulatory authorities there are the Mass Department of Environmental Protection, and in rare species habitat, Mass Wildlife. We also talk a lot about the guidelines in Massachusetts and on the Atlantic coast as in its entirety when we talk about plovers and to a certain extent terns. The guidelines in Massachusetts are guidelines for managing recreational use of beaches to protect piping plovers, terns, and their habitats. So these are Mass Wildlife's guidelines for how to avoid take, and I'll get into that in the next slide. And then the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has their own version of the guidelines that's specific to piping plovers. So the federal and state guidelines are fairly similar to each other. They're designed to avoid take, and they protect both the birds and the landowner by providing a set of procedures that, when followed, avoid take and therefore protect the landowner from liability. So those measures are probably things that you've seen on the beach: symbolic fencing to designate buffer areas where the birds can nest undisturbed, and restrictions on oversand vehicles or OSVs, pets, fireworks, and kites. So I just wanted to put up this diagram of how the regulators work together on regulations, beach nesting bird regulations. So as I mentioned before, the birds are regulated by Mass Wildlife and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The wetland resource areas those are the wetland resource areas designated in the Wetlands Protection Act. They include things like coastal beach and coastal dune, where that plovers and terns rely on for nesting. So the local Conservation Commission administers the Wetlands Protection Act under Mass DEP authority. So if it's birds only, Mass Wildlife is the regulator. If it's wetland areas only, it's Mass DEP and the Conservation Commission. And then where they intersect, the Conservation Commission and Mass Wildlife jointly regulate. So a lot of these things that involve plovers and terns are regulated both by Mass DEP/Conservation Commission as well as Mass Wildlife. But what I do want to point out is that the beach owner or beach managers, they adhere to the regulations. They aren't the regulators. So they're not deciding on what can and can't happen with respect to the birds or the wetlands habitat. It's the regulators that make those decisions. So just to give you some examples of projects or activities that might be regulated in beach nesting bird habitat, this is it's not an all-inclusive list, but things like beach raking, dune grass planting, OSV use, beach road maintenance, dredging, dune nourishment, and construction. So lots of things can trigger a review by a regulatory agency in Massachusetts on the beach, and probably anywhere else. So when Mass Wildlife approves projects in rare species habitat on the beach, we will approve the project with conditions to avoid take of beach nesting birds and their habitat. So those types of things include time of year restrictions. For instance, we generally wouldn't allow construction to occur during the beach nesting bird season. It would have to occur outside of that window. We would specify very gentle slopes for the dunes because the birds are deterred from nesting by steep dunes. Managing vehicle traffic on beach travel corridors so the birds don't get run over or disturbed. And then following the guidelines is always a facet of an approval in beach nesting bird habitat. So I want to draw your attention to the upper right figure of New England. So these are piping plover numbers in New England over the past few decades. And the pink lines in all of these graphs are the recovery goal, the federal recovery goal that's been set for the piping plover. So you can see that in New England, we've exceeded the recovery goal of population size for the piping plover. And so when people see a graph like this, they say, well, why are they still listed here then? We've done our job in New England and we've done it well, and that's all true. So the piping plover is part of the Atlantic coast population, and that's the federally listed population that nests from southern Canada down to South Carolina. And it's divided into 4 recovery units: Eastern Canada, New England, New York, New Jersey, and the Southern Recovery Unit. So even though it's doing really well in New England, we can't delist it in Massachusetts because we have to list it at the same or more imperiled status as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, as I talked about already. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is not ready to delist the piping plover because it's doing poorly, quite poorly in Eastern Canada and in the Southern Recovery Unit. And New York, New Jersey is really, really struggling now after, seeming like they were on a good track. So that listing status is really tied to the whole population and not just Massachusetts. So in order to delist the piping plover, there are multiple goals that have to be met. And 3 of them are sustained abundance goals, so they have to reach a population size of X, and it's different for each recovery unit, and that has to be sustained. It can't just be for 1 year. It has to be ongoing, sustained population goal being met or exceeded. There has to be a sustained productivity goal, so how productive they are in fledging chicks across the recovery units. And that is not being met in most of the recovery units. And then there have to be long-term agreements in place with landowners and agencies that are managing piping plovers to make sure that the successes in abundance and productivity can be maintained for the long term. So that's why piping plovers aren't going to be delisted federally and why they can't be delisted in Massachusetts. So let's take a look at Massachusetts specifically, and I want to walk you through this graph because it's quite busy. So on the left-hand axis is the number of piping plovers in Massachusetts with the orange bars, so that's a scale of 0 to 1,000. And on the right-hand axis is the number of plovers on Duxbury Beach, that's going from 0 to 35. There are not 1,000 pairs on Duxbury, at least not just yet. So there are about 180 nesting sites in the state, and they've really expanded over the past few decades, and they've even expanded to urban beaches that are, quite busy. Because of that, we've seen increasing conflicts with recreation. which is understandable, right? Because both the birds and the people want to be in these really nice recreational spaces. So the increase that we've seen at Duxbury is not unusual. We've seen this all around the state. Kudos to Duxbury. They're doing a really nice job managing the beach and providing good conditions for the birds, but the birds have increased everywhere. So you can see the trajectory of the black line of Duxbury Beach very closely tracking the trajectory of those orange bars statewide. So it's just a statewide trend that we're seeing. So realizing that there's a lot of strain on beach managers and beach owners, we've tried to provide some relief to them through our Piping Plover Habitat Conservation Plan program to allow greater recreational access. So this program has been active since 2016. It's a program to balance conservation of piping plovers with public access. And specifically what it does is it allows the beach owners to have a little more flexibility in managing the beach. They don't have to manage strictly according to the guidelines. So Mass Wildlife has what's called an incidental take permit that was granted by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It's a 26-year permit that allows take. So Mass Wildlife is the permit holder, and then we issue sub-permits to beach owners that allow them to participate in the program, and it authorizes them for certain types of take to allow increased beach access. But it's a very focused program. It's not a carte blanche, do whatever you want type of program with respect to plovers. There are specific covered activities. There are 3 covered activities. One is recreation and beach operations. Another is overseeing vehicle use in the vicinity of unfledged chicks. And then a third is use of improved roads and parking lots in the vicinity of unfledged chicks. So participants have to follow the guidelines except where they're specifically authorized to deviate from the guidelines through their participation in the HCP program. So I want to point out that the HCP is drawing on some really finite resources. There are limits associated with the program. So there are limits on acreage that can be impacted, and there are limits on take exposures. So take exposures are the number of pairs, impacts to pairs, basically. So there are limits to the number of pairs that can be impacted statewide, and there's a percentage limit on the number of pairs that can be impacted at a particular individual participating site. So Mass Wildlife might not be able to authorize all of the take exposures in the future because we do have that statewide limit that we always need to be cognizant of, and we can't expose more pairs than our permit allows. So it's very finite in that sense. And then the other finite resource that the HCP is drawing on is funding. Participants need funding for mitigation. They have to mitigate for each take exposure that they're permitted for. So if they impact one pair of plovers on the beach, they have to mitigate for between 2.5 and 3 additional pairs, depending on what their covered activities are. So it's approximately a 3-to-1 mitigation ratio. So that's costly for the participant. They also have to implement pretty extensive avoidance and minimization measures to reduce their likelihood of take. So they're authorized for take under the permit as long as they're doing their best to avoid it. So that's where those avoidance and minimization measures come in. And then there are pretty significant monitoring requirements, management requirements, and reporting requirements. The Duxbury Beach Reservation has been participating in the HCP program since 2018, and they're authorized now for 2 covered activities: roads and parking lots, and recreation and beach operations. And I think that they pretty significantly demonstrated their commitment to allowing recreation on the beach when they lobbied us several years ago to increase the percentage of pairs that could be affected at any single beach. So that was our first amendment that we put through to increase the percentage of the population at each individual beach that could be impacted, and that was specifically through DBR's advocacy to allow more recreational access. So currently, the reservation is permitted for the highest number of take exposures of any single participating beach. And they're taking up a significant number of the take exposures available. So we've got 11 permit sites, including a federal site that's not actually permitted by us, but still factors into our allocation. So there are 11 sites, including Duxbury. We've got 10 sites sharing about 77% of the take exposure allocation, and Duxbury Beach on its own is taking up about 21% of the state limit. And currently we only have 1 take exposure that hasn't been allocated. So I understand how frustrating it is when the birds are occupying a large portion of the beach and they're restricting recreational activities. But without the HCP, the closures would be more extensive and they would be in place for much longer. So again, I mean, we really do recognize and acknowledge that it's quite a balance for beach owners trying to meet the needs of recreationists on the beach as well as the needs of the birds. Because of this, we've pushed through several amendments to increase the latitude allowed in the HCP since it was enacted in 2016. And we've also taken measures to reduce its cost because the cost is borne by the participating organization, and the more birds you have, the more take exposures you have, the more costly it becomes. So we're trying to bring that down to just make the program as feasible as possible for the participants. With U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Mass Wildlife is exploring avenues for increased flexibility for beach owners and managers, both within and outside of the HCP. It's something we're actively working on. Some of these things are unfortunately not moving as fast as we would ideally like them to, but we are working on these things. And I do want to point out that beach managers and beach owners are often unfairly blamed for the restrictions that are really placed on them by the regulators to protect the birds. So they're really pulled in multiple directions. And so I wanted to make sure that I came here to speak with you all so you all had an understanding of how my agency as a regulator factors into the restrictions and how we are requiring things of the Duxbury Beach Reservation as a landowner with rare species on their property. So we're a regulator. We regulate the Duxbury Beach Reservation, and so we require conditions that protect the birds as a result of that regulation. So this is my email address. If you don't get a chance to talk with me tonight for whatever reason, but you'd like to reach out, please feel free to do so. Thanks for your attention, and when it's time, I'll be happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much. So As I said, we're going to open this up to questions and answers after the presentation. Ms. Mostello has graciously agreed to stay and answer questions as they come. Why don't we hear next from the Duxbury Beach Reservation? And to lead that off, why don't we ask for the president, Clark Hinckley, to provide some comments.
David came, just arrived.
Oh, okay. I did not notice Mr. Simmons' arrival. Mr. Simmons is the supervisor, Endangered Species Program, U.S. Fish and Wildlife. And Mr. Simmons, if you have a few words to say about the manner in which the beach is regulated by the federal government, that would be great.
I don't use microphones very often. Is that loud enough? Okay. First of all, I'm sorry I'm late. I got here as fast as I could, and then I was waiting in the wings. I didn't want to be a distraction. From what I saw, Carolyn did a great job describing the process of working with applicants to meet the requirements of the Endangered Species Act. So I work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Our office is in Concord, New Hampshire. Our job is to implement the Endangered Species Act in conserve species that are listed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as either threatened or endangered. And then we also help other folks, agencies, towns, anyone who needs assistance with compliance with the ESA. We work with them to accomplish what they need to while meeting the requirements in the Endangered Species Act. So with Mass Wildlife, this was not actually long before, after I joined the service in New England, we started working on this HCP, working towards an incidental take permit. And as Carolyn mentioned, there's specific criteria that need to be met to protect the species that are going to be on the permit, and those get extended. So when we prepared the HCP with Mass Wildlife, we got to a point where the document and the applicant met the criteria, and we could issue a permit, and then we work with Mass Wildlife as they implement that plan, and then so by extension, that's where Duxbury came in. And so that's a bit of an overview of how the Fish and Wildlife Service implements the Endangered Species Act with applicants.
Thank you, Mr. Simmons. And he has also agreed to stay and answer questions as they arise. So why don't we hear from Clark Hinckley, the president of the Duxbury Reservation.
Thank you, Wayne. Good evening, and thank you for attending our Duxbury Beach Reservation Community Forum. Our hope is to better inform the community about the beach and the environment we operate in. I am Clark Hinckley, president of the Duxbury Beach Reservation. On the dais with me tonight are Sue Rourke, our treasurer of the reservation and a director, Andre Martacchini, a director, and Chris Lattazzi, executive director of the reservation. Duxbury Beach Reservation is the owner of Duxbury Beach, and the reservation is a tax-qualified 501(c) public charity governed by the laws of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. The reservation's mission and its charter are to preserve the beach and its ecology as a barrier beach for the protection of Duxbury and Kingston, and as an environmental asset consistent with the primary ecological objective, and operate for the public a recreational beach. The beach is managed by a board of 11 directors, 17 trustees, and a professional staff led by our executive director, Chris Lattazzi. Up until 2017, the reservation was an all-volunteer organization, but the complexity of managing the 4.5 miles of beach in an ever-changing climate, regulatory restrictions, and the need for increasing funds To preserve the landform led us to hire professional management. While Chris is the spokesman for the reservation and has the responsibility for running the day-to-day operations, she does so with the support and direction of the board of directors. Chris has recently been portrayed as the cause of oversand accessibility issues. Nothing could be further from the truth, as she is the front person for the board policies. The reservation board is committed to operating the beach within applicable laws and regulations of the local community, the Commonwealth, and federal agencies, and fulfilling our mission statement. In short, any issues about beach access are not about the executive director, but about achieving a balance between protecting the ecology and the beachgoers while respecting laws and regulations. We are also committed to being prepared for inevitable change. We have been very fortunate that we have not had catastrophic damage since 1991, but we could have been like Florida, who recently had Hurricane Ian. But we certainly can't count on that devastation not happening right here in Duxbury. I would now like to introduce Chris Lattazzi, Executive Director of the Duxbury Beach Reservation. Chris?
Thank you. Thanks, Clark, and thanks to everybody for coming or tuning in if you're at home. I really am looking forward to this evening, to having a conversation and sharing ideas and participating and looking for solutions together for, I'm gonna do this because it's been so many years, ORV, OSV, they mean the same, for oversand access. We're here for one reason, all of us, I think, is that we all love Duxbury Beach. Whether it's winter walks, looking for seals, or you're doing the Tuesday night yoga, where you like to have campfires on the beach. I totally understand. I've been with a professional, what I call a professional OSVer. We were there on a Friday night. We had the Jeep, we had chairs, we had pizza, and he had a trash can. So I understand what it means to like the beach and want to be there. In the 1940s, my dad came here to help his fiance build one of the first homes on Gurnett Saquesh. And I look at those photos and I'm just struck in awe of how big the dunes were, that you could drive through them. Or if you drove on the back road, you wouldn't be able to see the ocean side because the dunes were in the way. I look at those and I get pretty jealous, to be honest. DBR was created to ensure the barrier beach remained open to all, rather than a chosen few. And that mission still continues today, 104 years later. DBR has been and is committed to remaining to be a champion for everyone to ensure that they can enjoy the beach. If you look around up and down Massachusetts coastline, we're all feeling the challenges around OSV access. There's increased erosion, loss of beach, more visitation, and record-breaking plover prayers. Later this evening, I'll be talking about the issues and measures that we may take moving forward, but first I wanted to give a little background. We'll be speaking briefly about Duxbury Beach Reservation, how it's a team management event, and then going over some of the misnomers that have been circulating, and then talking about opportunities we have with the permit that Carolyn has just walked us through. Since 1919, the barrier beach has been privately owned. But what some folks might not know is what Carolyn went over. The entire beach is considered a wetland. So that means we're classified under the Wetlands Protection Act and managed by 2 different agencies. We're also a priority habitat, the entire area, which means that we have listed species on the beach, not to mention the whole host of other acronym alphabet soup, marine fisheries, environmental protection. We're definitely not managing alone. Duxbury Beach Reservation is governed by what are called Articles of Incorporation. Some people refer to it as a charter. And there are 3 main parts: preserving the barrier itself, protecting the ecology, and ensuring that everyone has access. While all 3 are important, preserve has to be our #1 priority, because if there isn't a barrier beach, there is no ecology to protect, and there is no access to provide.
and therefore the coastlines of Duxbury and Kingston, which are in our Articles of Incorporation, would not be protected. Well, as I said, we certainly are not a one-man shop, and rather it's a three-legged stool. There's the owner, which is Duxbury Beach, then we also hold the permit. There's the town that manages the beach and invites people to come. And then the agencies and regulators to ensure that we abide by all the regulations. I just wanted to point out here on the bottom of the slide, it mentions non-essential vehicles. And that is basically a way of saying recreational vehicles. They're not essential to be there. They're not fire, police, or homeowners. And that's what all of us are when we visit the beach. So now I wanted to move into some of the topics that have been buzzing around. Many times I've heard or read, why doesn't Duxbury Beach do this when another beach does? And simply put, there are no two sites that are alike, and these images put it into perspective. My counterparts at Sandy Neck and Nauset, I'm going to admit I get pretty jealous, as well as beaches on the National Seashore and on Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard, because simply put, they can say, don't go left, go right. Go to the third trail and then turn onto the water. Duxbury Beach, as we all know, is much narrower. We don't have the opportunity to take a left or a right going around a beach. We have a small corridor and a ribbon of sand to drive on. Some folks think that DBR is creating a bird sanctuary. That's definitely not true, and simply put, it would be a direct violation of our Articles of Incorporation. Hence, we can't have a bird sanctuary. We're not looking to have a bird sanctuary. Ensuring public access is one of the tenets of our founding principles. Also, we enjoy the revenue from the town lease that invites everybody to come to the beach. Another piece that's out there is that we're planning to close the OSV per an internal document. DBR is not planning on closing the OSV. That was for planning purposes. Let's say in 1 to 3 years, we need to have a plan. And the discussion said exactly what I had said previously. Without the landform, we won't have any place to protect ecology or invite people to access. But it is the board's responsibility, as well as mine, to look at future scenarios. One of those that we were discussing was evident about a month and a half ago. It was September 11th, it was a Sunday, it was a full moon. I was on the beach in the morning, and I was watching swells come in. I actually saw 2 women with surfboards at Blakeman's going out, something I don't normally see at Duxbury and Blakeman's. But you can see here that the cars were parking parallel. And this is exactly what we were thinking, and that we still are thinking we need to plan. You can see that there is a berm that was created here, and then there was water. So it forced the cars to park parallel. This is unfortunately something that we are going to see when we have full moons, high tides. And the reason we had higher tides that day is that there were remnants of a hurricane going towards Nova Scotia, and that's why we wound up having big swells. But this is the point of what we need to figure out and plan for. And it would be a dereliction of duty if we weren't planning for it. Another question out there is, why was the word recreation replaced in the mission? And it's a prelude to closing the OSV. In 2019, I realized that the giant paragraph that's our Articles of Incorporation, no one could possibly remember or recite. And I go back to those days of the 3-minute elevator speech. So we came up with a shorter mission statement. Well, it turns out, 2021, we realized it's not nearly as short as we thought it was. It's safeguard adjacent bays and towns. It was all accurate. It was just too long to put in all our marketing materials. So hence, we shortened it. And we came up with a 3-word tagline: preserve, protect, and enjoy. It's just as if Nike had their tagline, just do it. That tagline doesn't say what they do or what they're responsible for. That's in their own charter Articles of Incorporation. So just like ours, our charter is what we manage to, and our tagline is marketing. Efforts have been made in accordance to ensure that we always manage to our articles. Something else out there is DBR creates replicated habitats for plovers and terns. Well, that is correct. In 1999, the state, Fish and Wildlife, where Carolyn works, asked us to create replicated or artificial habitats. These were created to entice the birds not to be in the OSV. The idea was that if we set up nice habitats right next to their foraging area on the bayside, that the birds would stay there. Well, in 2020, we wound up observing that the birds, ironically, were crossing the road to get to the ocean side. And when we saw that, we realized that we were putting birds in peril for crossing the road, and we closed the artificial habitats with the request of the state on that. So it's true the habitats would not have existed, but now we're letting them grow in. And this is a picture of where those habitats are. What you're looking at here is high pines, and then there were 6 of them to begin with, and then there were 5. And you can see that we had ripped out grass. But what happened was they were crossing over up here, and then they were trying to get to the OSV, which would have led to more birds and limiting access. Who determines when a crossover is open? Well, simply put, the town beach operations consults with DBR during the listed species season to determine if regulations would close the beach. This goes back to Carolyn's talk as a reminder that we have to figure out where the birds are and what access we have, and then the town makes the ultimate decision of what crossovers can be opened and can't be. And the town also sets the limits on the beach, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So as a reminder, we have a permit that allows the beach owner to expose plovers to risk. The owner applies for participation and requests a number of takes. I refer to them as tokens because it makes it easier for me. You spend a token, you don't get the token back after you spend it. The goal isn't to educate everybody here on how to manage listed species, but I wanted to run through a couple things that I think might help make it clear. So there are covered activities, as Carolyn said. The first one in no order is use of roads and parking lots in vicinity of unfledged chicks. Our entire property falls under this category because we have a road that runs right through the entire priority habitat. So we definitely have a permit for this. The second is recreational management that can be broken into 3 levels. Reduce the fencing around a nest, reduce proactive fencing for the habitat, and nest moving. And we also have a permit for that. The third is OSV use in the vicinity that some people might have heard of. That's escorting vehicles. We'll talk about that in the next presentation, but we do not have a permit for that. So as Carolyn mentioned that we have 12 takes or tokens, and we're allowed to use those that wind up putting plovers at risk. So first we have to decide how much mitigation we need, how many plovers are literally going to cross the road in any given season, and then ask the state and show that we can do mitigation for those. So as Carolyn said, we have more tokens than anybody else in the state. The problem is, on our average, 5 years, we've had 10 birds cross the road, or broods. Once you spend those tokens for the 10, you can't get them back. That leaves us 2 tokens left to use barriers or herding. If we use one, we've spent one. Deter nesting, reduce nesting, and move the nest. So let's say we use all of those. What happens? That means that our entire property would be closed. If we run out of tokens, we don't have a permit, and we can't drive through our property because it's priority habitat. This isn't having to do with driving on the beach. This has to do with parking at the residence lot, driving on the back road. Just because you have a permit doesn't mean you can actually implement. There's a couple things that you need. One is you must receive the permit. Then you must have the funding for the exposures. You must have experts on the beach that see that there's an opportunity to use something, and the birds have to cooperate and be in the right place. If you can do that, you can take an action under your permit. This is a picture that I'm not normally used to showing because if I zoom in further, I get in trouble. But this shows you where the nests are distributed throughout our property. I point out where crossovers 1, 2, and 3 are. We're going to go into some examples, and it makes it a lot clearer. I think a picture of something works a lot better. So what we do is we track, my colleagues do, where all the nests are, where the openings are, every day, every bird movement, every GPS location, so we can figure out their ranges. If you look at other beaches, they're wider, they have different locations, and they're spread out. So in general, on Duxbury Beach, there are 3 main reasons why parts of the beach would be closed. Setbacks for nests, setbacks for chicks, or chicks have entered the road or parking lot. And remember, the property is 4 miles long, 4.5, so that's 4.5 miles of road. And I put the dates in here because it gives you kind of an idea of what we're looking at for nests. And it looks like in the beginning of late April that we'll have nests. But the last nest to be laid in Massachusetts, I believe, was July 12th. There's some party that we have that's around that time that we're like, okay, we've made it past the 12th. On record, there's never been a nest laid since then. So basically, it has to do with what human activity you want to do and at what life stage is the bird. Is it an egg? Is it a chick? So I'm all for pictures and graphics. What we're looking at here is crossover 2. This is also where you do the big turnaround, and this is high pines. Make sense? Nod. Thanks. So let's say we have a nest. The first thing we need to do is fence it 50 meters. I was kind of lazy and I didn't do a circle, but it's 50 meters all around. My joke is always, if we actually fenced it 50 meters, our fencing would be in Cape Cod Bay, because we don't have 50 meters on the beach. But if the nest is there, we fence it 50 meters, and that means the crossover is open, hence the green check mark. Once the nest hatches, the chicks hopefully stay in a small area. That's called a brood range, and that's the little opening where the chicks are right now. The fencing then has to grow from 50 meters to 200 meters. When that happens, you can see that the crossover is close. If you watch the birds like we do, I'd say like a hawk, but that's probably a bad analogy. We watch the birds really carefully, and after 7 days, if they haven't moved out of that small range, then we're able to reduce the fencing to 100 meters, and the crossover opens again. The situation happens that these birds don't stay still too much. So when they move, then we have 100 meters, and the crossover closes again. There's also some notes about that there's no requirements for lease turn protection. And I apologize. I know that Carolyn's gone through this, but it's important to know that lease turns are protected in Massachusetts endangered species. And by law, beach managers need to manage those. We have a permit that's not only our Habitat Conservation Plan permit, or COI, we also have a conservation management permit for lease turns as well. Lease turns have been fenced in Massachusetts for quite a few decades. Another note out in the public is that lease turns nest in the dunes away from the OSV. This is inaccurate as well. They nest where plovers are in the open beach, right exactly where we want to drive. And these are just quotes from Fish and Wildlife of where they're nesting. So you don't need to take my word for it. Go to the source. And as Carolyn mentioned, these birds don't actually stay in one place. They usually wander. And it's the wandering that is kind of the challenge. The third is that lease turns are being improperly cited to justify extended beach closures. Well, it's simply a calendar of math. The plovers show up. Several weeks later, the least terns show up. So when you have the least terns, you're getting into another whole cycle with another whole species. So I've said to folks, the bird that closes the crossover is not the bird that opens the crossover, because there's multiple birds there, and it could be more than one species. So we'll talk about least terns for just a second. For least terns, notice it says yards versus meters. There is a 100-yard buffer for least tern colony. In this scenario, we have crossover one closed. And that's because no vehicles within 100 yards of least terns. But since we have our permit, we have permission to drive by, just not park near, within 100 yards of a least tern. So this is why it's important to have the permit. Because if we're not parking within 100 yards, we then can park in any open space next to them after 100 yards. In order to do this, it requires additional work. So you have to have monitors. We would put up barriers for the least terns and shelters as well to encourage the birds to stay in one place. It's really important that people understand our motto, our motto is one and done. And that's because when the bird nests, if there's no interruptions, it'll nest and incubate its eggs for a couple weeks, and then it will take another 25 plus days. I don't want to say days because people will write them all down, but every bird's different. It'll take another 25, 30 days for the bird to fledge. If that nest is interrupted, if they wound up getting predated, if that nest gets overwashed, if there's activity and the bird leaves or abandons the nest, it'll wait 7 days and start the process all over. And if that nest goes, it'll start the process all over. And then again. So I've seen the highest is 4 renests. I don't know if that 4th one was real. It's not good for the bird because they just take up a lot of time and they lay less eggs and they're not as productive. I mean, I see that the birds, the nests, and I should look at the experts here, but usually the chicks from the first nest are a lot healthier and vigorous than chicks from the 4th attempt of a nest. So that's why the motto at Duxbury Beach is one and done. Get the birds in, make sure they're uninterrupted, and they don't continue that cycle. Because remember, they can nest in April, but they can also nest in July. So when do crossovers have to stay closed for tern chicks? It's when the nursery goes straight across. Then we can't drive through it. And that would be an example of when the crossover would be closed. So why doesn't Duxbury Beach move nests? Well, sometimes the option for not moving is a better option. So this is an example of you have a nest and 50 meters, which is the fencing, would close the crossover. The agency has asked us and everybody to try a different method first, which is what we employed this year. This year was the first time ever we had a nest that closed a crossover, meaning it was in the 50 meters. We've never had that before. So if I had this meeting in June and someone said, "Why have you never moved a nest?" My answer would be, because it never closed a crossover. So I can't say that anymore, because this year a bird nested within 23 meters of a crossover. So what we did is followed the regs, waited until there were 4 eggs, which is a total clutch for the nest, and then we're able to move the fencing back. A lot easier than trying to move a nest. If we're able to move the fencing and show that the adult didn't stop incubating, then we're able to drive by the nest. This took 3 days for the whole process, and we're able to open the crossover again. If we did have a nest in a crossover, then we would go to the state and we would ask if we could move. There are regulations for this. You can only move a nest twice for so many feet each day. You can't move into another territory. But then the problem is, don't forget, it's 50 meters. So we would have to move the nest, really 200, if we wanted to keep it open. And 200 meters, I have to say, I know that there's permission, but has the state ever actually had anyone move a nest?
No one has ever taken advantage of that latitude in the HCP because it's not a preferred option. It's much riskier. So what we want people to do first is to reduce fencing. That's the safer option.
And it kind of follows our one and done as well, because if we try to move the nest and then the adult abandons it, we start the whole process over again. So this is an example that if we moved it and moved it 50 meters, then when it hatched, it would still be well within the 200 meters and it would close the crossover. Deterrence. DBRs use some deterrence. I think one that got people's attention. I couldn't figure out what this photo was. I went to trusty Facebook, and there it was. In 2022, we tried plastic wrap. Don't ask, that was a really bad idea. I figured you could wrap boats, you could wrap a beach. It didn't work. We also tried to put plastic bags and hand rake twice a day to deter birds from nesting. This is a parking lot that crosses, that's on the other side of Blakeman's. We call it the Blakeman's overflow lot. Deterrents work for us, and we'd utilize them for parking lots, edges of parking lots, OSV crossover, pedestrian pathway. This was a fail. We tried everything, and when I say we had multiple people hand raking the parking lot twice a day, I remember Dana Batista taking a picture. He's like, "What were they doing?" I'm like, "Raking." I can't remember how many acres, but it's a big parking lot. The problem is that it's only about 50% effective. There have been many attempts statewide. My favorite story is my friends at Sandy Neck. They took the sand fencing and they put it flat down on the ground to deter the birds from nesting. The bird nested in between the slats. So again, let's put this in DBR perspective. If we were to deter a nesting, to attempt to deter, we would put something down to stop them from nesting. We would want to go the full 200 meters, right? We don't want to do 60 meters and then the eggs hatch. The next thing you know, you have to close the crossover. So we would close it to 200 meters. This is approximately 1.85 acres, which winds up being just shy of the 2-acre maximum for deterring. The birds nest, crossover's open, we're good. The question is, how much did it cost us? It cost us 2 tokens because we have to look and see what birds were nesting where we put the deterrents the year before. The eggs hatch, it's 200 meters, and then the birds move. Crossover's closed, we've spent 2 deterrents, 2 tokens, and it's just the beginning of the season. If we were confident that deterrence would help gain OSV access, then we would use them. Barriers. Some people have seen barriers that are at Blakeman's. What you're looking at here, I can't even turn my head that way, that's Blakeman's building, that's the paved parking lot, and the red denotes where the barrier was put up. The reason we were able to put up a barrier is because the plovers, you wouldn't want this, you'll figure it out. We wanted to keep from crossing the parking lot and the road in the parking lot because there's no foraging habitat here. It's all salt marsh. So we were keeping them on the beach so we wouldn't be having them get run over. And that is one of the barriers that we used. This is not under the HCP permit because Duxbury Beach Park and that northern lot have a salt marsh that's behind it. So it's not considered plover habitat on the west side of the road. None of the barriers blocked access to habitat, and that's why the barrier was allowed, because there is no habitat to the west side of where the red line is. We do use barriers for chick pathways. I know one person in the crowd isn't really a fan of them. But we do this for good reason. If we put those in the pathway, and we have plovers that like to go down pathways, and they go into the resident lot, then the resident lot becomes part of the brood range, and then part of the lot gets closed. So if you notice at the large pedestrian walkover across from the bridge that has mobility mats down, that there are people there making sure that the chicks don't go down that pathway during the hours that the beach is open. Because if they did go down the pathway and then they crossed into the parking lot, that would be very bad. Because the bridge is there and that's the access for a lot of people. And we wouldn't want to start putting fencing around the around the parking lot. And then at nighttime, because we're not there, we put the barriers up. We leave one open because people have mobility issues, hence the mobility mats, but that's why the other resident pathways are closed. Where we don't use barriers is on the beach for chicks because it's not permitted to block their access for habitat. And to be honest, I don't think anyone here that's passionate about OSV use would want us to trap the birds on the side where the OSV is. Last one, I promise. Do wooden shelters entice nesting? The short answer is no. These aren't plovers, these are lease terns. And no bird nests under these that we know of. But they're there for a reason. So they help chicks thrive and survive. And these are for tern chicks. So Carolyn and I had both mentioned that they can move up to 200 meters. Well, in some instances, you don't want them to move. You want them to stay there, grow, and leave, one and done. Last year, we put up 4 of these. They're only put up when a crossover is already closed, and that was out of 388 pairs and their offspring. So we use them when necessary. The goal was to be able to open the crossover. If they stay out, they're not as healthy, they might not fly as quickly as others. Also, they're part of our mitigation that we're supposed to do. So what does the permit provide? It allows a tool that, used to its fullest extent, will give us the opportunity to use it whenever we can, when the birds are in the right place, when we have the right permits, and we have the smart people on the beach to know when to use those. However, it's important to note that it's not free. The amount that you pay is dependent on the covered activity. As Carolyn said, those tokens are limited, and it's getting harder and harder to get as many tokens as you'd like because there's more competition, and there's not an endless amount. So that these key things, I hope you remember, is that our goal is to use your tokens wisely. The season starts on April 1st. I know a lot of people like to think that it's around school kids. I wish it was, to be honest. It would make it a lot shorter season for us. But by law, we have to have our fencing up by April 1st, and then we have to start implementing all of our regs. And that goes through to the last bird fledges. And if you have any questions, I would really recommend that you reach out directly to Duxbury Beach Reservation. We're happy to answer your questions. And again, we're committed to OSV access whenever permissible and legal. So I hope this sheds some light on the requirements and responsibilities that are managed on a daily basis. Thank you.
So I guess, as described as the third part of the stool, is the Town of Duxbury. And we have officials from the Town of Duxbury talking about the manner in which, what the town's role is in managing and using the beach.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for coming. I'm Rainey Reed, I'm the town manager, and Steve Studley is our recreation director. He oversees the beach operations management aspect. I just want to recognize that 3 of my board members are here also, Amy McNabb, Mike McGee, and Cindy Ladd-Fiorini, and I want to thank you for being here. I also want to say hi to, I'll clap. That's right. I want to say hi to Mike Jackman from Congressman Keating's office, and I also want to say hi to Susan Moran from Josh Cutler's office. Thank you for being here. It means a lot. And thanks for having us. This is a good thing. I think it's important that we all talk about this, and you can see what kind of pressures are often applied throughout the season of the beach. Our role, for Steve and I, is I'm the guy that's trying to sell you a sticker and trying to convince you that it's a good idea to go to the beach. The beach sort of sells itself, if anybody's ever been there. It's becoming more challenging for us, though, as many of you know, with the number of birds that we're seeing and the length of the closures. So what we try to do is work with the reservation when they provide us the information and figure out the best way to try and get people out there. How do we maximize your time out there? The last couple of years have been pretty tricky. In fact, this year we saw something I haven't seen in the 20-plus years I've lived here. We saw the opening of the third crossover. And that was a decision, and just to give you anecdotal information, based on if you've got 3 crossovers, there are certain capacities that you can have. We are under the guise that we can have a 500-car capacity, 250 resident and 250 non-resident. And so once we know what the linear footage is, we do a calculation and we can tell you how many cars we can get out there at a given time. In this case, the first crossover and the third crossover provided us with the most capacity, whereas the second crossover didn't provide us with as much. So we were only able to open the 2 crossovers. And you're probably saying, well, why didn't you open all 3? That's staffing demands. We only have a limited number of staff. We have, this year we had 22 beach rangers, and we had 22 the year before because we changed the operation. We're trying to figure out the way to run it the most efficiently, the most effectively. And the DBR hires the monitors. They're the people that sit there and watch the birds during the day. So they have their employees on shifts, as we do as well. The trick is, though, when you're closed for, as we were this year, 53 days, the trick is trying to attract and retain employees that want to stay there without guarantee of actually having the work. So in many cases, the 22 kids that we hired out there weren't going to be able to stick around because they're running on a 12-week window themselves. They're home from vacation. We try to line them up in February, March, and April and get them ready to get out there. But when the beach is closing early, and it's closing on a day called the 4th of July, they're not really sticking around. They're going to go look for other work. They may be doing landscaping, working retail somewhere, doing anything else. So it's tough for us too. So with that, we're trying to strike a balance and figure out the best way to be able to, like I said, maximize your time out there and hope that you can enjoy it. But I'm here to answer any questions, as is Steve.
So that does, in fact, lead us into the question and answer portion of this program. There are microphones set up. What I'd ask you to do is identify yourself, tell us where you live.
There's one more presentation.
Do we have another presentation? All right, let's do that.
Okay. This is much shorter and sweeter, I promise. So as we've heard from each discussion, we all have roles to play on Duxbury Beach. So this part is where we start to kind of hit the rubber to the road. What are people's concerns as we understand them? What are some amendments that we've considered? What town measures have been discussed? And what measures from DBR? So basically, DBR, the town, Carolyn, we've all met for multiple hours to kind of go through what do we do, what aren't we doing, what could we be doing, and if we're not doing them, why we're not doing it. And as I mentioned, it's definitely kind of your I was going to say three-ring circus. I probably shouldn't say that. This is why I should write my notes. But it's definitely 3 different pieces that are all together that are trying to work this through. So what we understand, and I have to say that I met some folks today, so if I'm speaking incorrectly and representing, my apologies. There's been discussion, but we want to talk about what measures we can take. And those concerns seem to be summarized into OSV access has been significantly reduced due to listed species. Some feel that DBR is not utilizing the HCP permit to its full capacity, and sticker holders feel that they're not getting their money's worth. So when sitting down with Carolyn, we talked about different options. And I have to say, as we run through these, the goal is not to get really complicated. But for every decision we make, one, we have to ask the state for permission and put it into our permit. Two, we have to find the funding for those mitigation points. So something that we've spoken about with Rainey and Steve last week, as well as with Carolyn, is keeping some of the pullouts open during a partial or complete OSV closure. Reducing buffer setbacks for lease turns, and reducing symbolic fencing at pedestrian pathways, because we're looking at access for all, though we understand a lot of people's focus is OSV. All of these have a cost with those. When I say cost, we have to figure out if we can get the tokens, how much the tokens cost, and if we're able to implement to begin with. So we need to ask for permission. For the town, we broke it into 3 different groups of things. We always have a postmortem at the end of the season. As Rainey just spoke about, the new policy is to look at all 3 crossovers and open 2 crossovers whenever possible, to utilize the 3rd crossover if it's the best option for access, and that basically says wherever you can get more cars, that would be the top 2 that you'd choose. Stop me if I say it incorrectly. And that means you're maximizing the number of vehicles. So if you have crossover 1, 2, and 3, and they can fit 50 cars, 60 cars, 70 cars, then you'd go for the one that's 60 and 70. The other is to reduce the minimum vehicle capacity for opening. So there's always discussion about, is 2 cars too small to have a crossover open? Or is that going to cause a lot of people to get angry? Like, where is that minimum where you have it open? And the town is looking at those numbers of what's feasible to manage. Does it make sense to open a crossover if only 2 cars? And I'm giving you like lowest number possible as an example. The other is a communication, I shouldn't say change it, well, they're updates. So one thing is we want to make sure that whenever a crossover is closed after March 15th, that DBR is in that discussion with the town to make sure that we have as much activity on the beach when we normally do. And also indicate in the town with the updates what the reasons for the crossovers are. I think sometimes right now, any crossover is associated with a bird or a DBR decision. So I think it's important for that full disclosure, if you will, to know why crossovers are closed. And then I put this one in, announce where and when the pedestrian accesses are, because I feel that people might not know with all the string and fencing that they can go down here and then they can cut through a certain area. So we're gonna be working together to put that on kind of the weekly information. Yes, that goes out to beach sticker holders. And then the third one is really tricky. And this is like, as Rainey was saying, and I've spoken to Steve so many times about this, budget and staffing. You know, everybody says this, but it's so much different now that we're not post, but now that COVID has been on the scene, and that trying to find people, I think, Carolyn, you could probably speak to this as well, is that it's so absolutely difficult. I mean, would you rather sit on the beach, or would you like to ride a tractor and get $25 an hour? A lot of people go for the landscaping. I know someone that went for ice cream because the freezer is colder than on the beach. I won't name any names, but their parents are in the audience. So the point is that it was already a struggle. I think we have it a little bit easier than Steve does, because the folks that work for my colleagues is that they want to be on the beach because they all are college graduates or in college for biology, marine biology, ecology. So they're there not just for a paycheck, but to have it on their resume. But any of these extra bits of extending opening hours, utilizing one-lane corridors, opening pullouts, and doing escorting is going to cost people, and that's going to cost money for the town. So DBR measures, we put in a whole bunch of those. Remind beachgoers of updated rules allowing increased pedestrian use of the beach. Work with the beach managers group. A couple years ago, I started a monthly Massachusetts beach managers group. It was basically to steal everybody's great ideas and learn from their mistakes. It's turned more into a cathartic, I don't know, sad, crazy hour of people going, and then the guy said this to me. So it's more of a therapy hour right now during the summer, but the crazy thing is, believe it or not, we were discussing in March and April, people are getting angry. The population is going up. What are we gonna do, and how can we have the state and federal agencies kind of get involved, at least to kind of send the message out that it's not just the beach managers wanting to keep people off the beach. It's not that at all. It's just that the population has increased and there's a finite space. So we decided that it was too busy during the summer to contact the regulators because they had their own things to do. And Carolyn is having her annual meeting, and we're going to be discussing some of these kind of what are the messages we can give, and what is everybody doing. And there's over 100 people that are going to be at that meeting, and it's good to find out what works and what doesn't, because all of the beaches in some way are facing an increased plover population, which from an ecology point of view is not a bad thing. We're going to continue with town meetings. Steve will get the full brunt of this. I'm sure he'll love it. There's weekly meetings on Zoom. There's weekly meetings on site during the season. And then we use the dreaded Slack that has more channels, I think, than my TV does at home, that talks about everything. So if you want to know what's going on with a seal that's been found on the beach, it's okay, they belong there. That'll be all on our communication. And also to make sure that we continue communication with the public. We started a Get to Know series during COVID. And we've now started a FAQ page that went live a couple weeks ago. We're waiting to add more and more questions, but we figured we'd wait until this evening to hear what the big ones are. So people will have a source to go and get information. If we wind up implementing some of the pieces, discussing with the town what we're able to do, then we'll look to enhance beach ops education, because they would need to be involved if they decided to do escorting, and we're happy to answer questions about that. And also reduce the wait time for crossing events for herding. Now, this is a little weird, but it gets different for Gurnet Saquish people when the road's closed. So looking at a Gurnet person, Saquish person, saying it might still be a half an hour for Gurnet Saquish when the road is closed, but this is when the road is open. So how you can help. Use the crossovers, and I should say the pedestrian as a pedestrian. There are pedestrian pathways over there and get to use full beach. Remember that monitoring and data collection are what keeps our beach open and gets those fences reduced by those people. Taking information, data collecting, they have down to literally the day when the eggs are gonna hatch. So we're able to calculate the very day, 24 hours before, when the crossover should close. If we weren't watching the birds, then we could just say, yeah, it's going to be in the next week, and we would close it earlier. But we're very dedicated to making sure it stays open as long as possible. Watch and attend the Get to Know series and submit questions to that, because we use the questions everybody sends. And I didn't talk to the town about this one, but attend the Duxbury annual town meeting and advocate for an increased budget. That, just like that. You can
Comment on that one? I'm going to hold off till March.
I think we are now at a point where there are questions that can be put to the various panelists. We'll ask people to line up at one of the microphones, identify themselves, and ask their question. Again, I'd ask you to direct the question either to me or to a particular panel as opposed to any particular individual.
I have a question. Dave Grunewald, Tremont Street, Duxbury. I fully understand what you're saying about the protection of the endangered species. I have no problem with all of that, and you need to close the beach, you need to close the beach. What I have an issue with is whether the town of Duxbury will prorate a refund for those days that aren't used. And if not, why not? Thank you.
Rainey, I think that goes to you.
Yeah. Thank you, Wayne. This is a question that we've been asked in the past, probably a decade ago when I first started here. In fact, some of you may remember my notorious arrival. I came here in May, and 10 days later we had to shut the beach down for 31 days. It was not a pleasant start. And that brought forward a series of questions just like yours. Why aren't the stickers refundable? Well, they've never been refundable, but at that time, people weren't told that they were not refundable. In fact, we found ourselves in a lawsuit over that one question. The town prevailed. So it wasn't enough to win the case. I thought it was a huge dissatisfier just to say they're not refundable. So what we did was a couple of things. The first thing we did was we provided weekly updates on the status of the beach and whether sticker holders would be able to access the beach or not. We gave them counts on the number of birds, estimated departure times, advised people to show up early, tried to help them out as much as we could so that they could make an informed decision before they bought the sticker. The other thing we did, we automated the sticker sales and went online so that when we did that, we had at least 5 or 6 stopgap measures to make sure that everybody knew that was purchasing a sticker that they were non-refundable. And I understand the question because people are laying out a couple $100, $300 for a sticker, residents and non-residents, and they wanted their money back. But it isn't that kind of a situation. So what we did is we just tried to provide as much information in advance before they made the purchase, knowing that there would be restrictions in place. Because we weren't dealing with just closures at the time, we were dealing with restrictions that would drop the number down to 30 cars a day. So we wanted people to be able to make an informed decision right out of the gate.
Next question.
How you doing? Andrew Marshall, Lantern Lane. I know you said no speeches. I have just a little quick opening statement, and I promise I'll be brief. And then I have one question for the DBR and one for the regulators. My name is Andrew Marshall. I'm here.
The thing I asked is that if you have more than one question, you wait your turn.
Okay. Well, I have 100, so. My name is Andrew Marshall. I'm here tonight with other members of our organization, Save Duxbury Beach. We appreciate the opportunity to work with you on finding a better balance of preservation, conservation, and recreation on Duxbury Beach. We understand the need for wildlife management. However, we know there are additional tools that can be used to keep the portions of the beach open. We've heard talk that because of poor sticker sales, the town may be considering not renewing the lease in 2024. The lease and overstand sticker sales have been a reliable source of revenue for both the DBR and the town. As we all know, overstand vehicles account for 75% of the beach revenue, and without us, there's no dune restoration. Have you considered how this would impact the future of the beach, the birds, and the townspeople? But I do want to say thank you for your willingness to engage with us tonight in the community. My first question is for the DBR. The DBR relies on the lease revenue from the town to fund storm damage repair, and sticker sales have been declining due to the beach closures. If the town does decide to stop leasing the beach, how does the DBR plan on make up this revenue for our storm damage of our barrier beach?
That's a really good question. When I started 5 years ago, one of my concerns, because my background is finance to fish, as I looked at the numbers and realized that the income streams were not nearly as diversified. So we worked really hard to reduce our dependency on any one stream to make sure that we have multiple streams coming in. I would have to say that if the town decided not to lease the beach, we certainly would still be able to protect. We would change our revenue stream, because revenues don't, and our streams don't give the marching orders for Duxbury Beach. It's our articles of incorporation.
If you had the second question, why don't you ask it now?
Oh, sure. This one is for the regulators. This question for David and Carolyn. And is a plover crossing on a road considered a take on all beaches or just Duxbury Beach?
Typically, if plovers were crossing from one side of the beach to the other, a site that was not participating in the habitat conservation plan would have to close the road. So there would be no takes for that reason. There would be no recreational beach access because the beach would be closed to vehicle traffic from the ocean side to the bay side in the vicinity of where the chicks were. So there are, other beaches in the HCP that have these same covered activities, roads and parking lots that are getting charged for take exposures for recreational use.
But this is our main take, that is a bird crossing the road, not necessarily interacting with a vehicle.
Right, because the guidelines, remember that the HCP allows deviations from the guidelines. The guidelines specify that to avoid take in the vicinity of unfledged chicks, roads have to be closed from the ocean side to the bay side when unfledged chicks are present. So the HCP is allowing opening of the road to recreational traffic at Duxbury Beach.
Thank you.
Good question. Yeah, I know it's a little complicated to understand.
Next question, please.
Friend Weiler Sr., 7 Trout Farm Road. I have a question for the reservation. When you were listing the various parties that you consider to be important to all of this, the town, the reservation, and the 2 state and federal agencies, why didn't you include the Duxbury Conservation Commission? The commission issues orders and conditions, which dictates the activity on the beach, and do you not have to comply with those as well?
Absolutely. I actually realized that Carolyn had the same slide, friend, so I decided not to read all of them that I had, and it turns into alphabet soup. But clearly, Duxbury Conservation Commission is on the list with the Wetlands Protection Act, as well as the others for endangered species, as well as all the other marine, et cetera.
Another question, please.
Go ahead.
I guess I'm next. My name is Steve Carlton. The question or the point that I have for both the town and the reservation is, why can't you use the information that you have now and do a survey of the people that bought stickers this past year, 2022, and ask those people very directly, will you buy stickers this coming year in 2023? Let me just take a little bit side trip on that same question. I own business property, my wife and I, on St. George Street, and we own an ice cream shop there. When the beach reopened, I had an opportunity to talk to the people who were now starting to use the beach, and I was asking them the question, will you buy beach stickers next year? So here's the results of my survey. I talked with 27 cars. There were multiple people in the cars. 15 of the cars, 15 of the 27, said yes, they'd buy stickers for next year. 6 were a no, and 6 were a maybe. What was interesting to me was none of the people that I talked with, they weren't mad, they weren't upset. They were understanding of the situation, they were just disappointed. One of the things from another aside, from a positive point of view was, and this is another recommendation to the reservation, is the beach that out-of-town people go to, the Red Sticker people go to, the one that's north of Blakeman's, they very much like that beach. And for those of you that haven't been there, it's a very nice beach. It's very easy for people to get from the parking lot to the beach itself, and there are very few rocks there. So that was a valuable resource for the people that from out of town to go to when the beach was closed. Again, from what I can see, when they fill out an application, whether they're out-of-town people or townspeople, they've supplied to you their email address. It doesn't seem to me that it would be a very difficult task for both the town and the reservation to ask the question, will you buy a sticker next year? And from that, you can decide a lot of things. Maybe people are willing to roll with what the conditions were in the past year, and maybe they're not. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So the question goes to both the town and the reservation as to whether they wanted to poll the patrons.
Do you mind? Go ahead. Thanks for the question, Steve. It's a good idea. I'll talk to the Treasurer Collector's Office, see if we can actually do that. Don't suspect the response will be warm, but facts are facts, and that's what we like to deal with. So I appreciate the suggestion. Thank you.
From the reservation point of view, the beach sticker holders are the clients of the town. We don't have access to that information.
Next question over here, please.
Thank you, Wayne. Michael McGee, 900 Tremont Street. My question is for the regulators. Why is a 501c3 charged for these take exposures or tokens, and where does that money go? And for the federal end of it, why is there a statewide limit, particularly in New England, where we've doubled the goals of the federal?
I didn't quite catch your first question, but was it, where does the mitigation funds go?
I think the thrust of his question is, why is a nonprofit charged for the takes?
Correct. And where does that money go?
Okay, so the reason for the charge is that in the HCP program, if you cause a take, then you have to mitigate for that take. And so funds that are collected through mitigation fees are used towards providing better nesting conditions for plovers elsewhere to make up for that loss. So there's actually two ways that mitigation can happen. It can happen on the beach where the take is taking place, or it can happen off-site. But that's what the funds go towards.
There was a second component of that question that went to the federal regulator. You want to re-ask that, Mike?
Why is there a limit? Thank you.
Well, I guess there might be a couple reasons why there's a limit. One of them might be that so with the criteria to get an incidental take permit under the Endangered Species Act, the applicant has to minimize and avoid and minimize to the maximum extent practicable. So they have to tailor their activities, while meeting their needs. They can't, and it's something that we need to determine if they may be affecting more of the the species on the permit, then they might need to implement the covered activities. So that's one reason there might be a limit on the number that may be taken. Although the HCP does, the number that can be taken changes with the population of plover, so we did build in some flexibility there to adjust for the population to an extent. The other reason there might be a limit is that, like Carolyn said, if you can't avoid and minimize the unavoidable take has to be mitigated, and that could become cost prohibitive at some point. Or there may just not be a way to mitigate after you reach a certain limit. So that could be another reason for limit on the number of takes allowed.
Next
Hi.
question.
Monica Vidette, 9 Bird of Elm Street. My question is to Mr. Studley and Mr. Reed. What steps are you taking to prevent the staffing issues? Have you considered a volunteer program? As a lifelong resident of Duxbury, I know myself I'd be happy to volunteer time to, police the bleach or whatever that is required should there be staffing shortages.
I'm going to let Steve answer that, but don't leave here without me getting your address.
Yes, no, first, I appreciate that offer. If you do go to the town's website, the HR department, we keep those positions of beach ranger as volunteered or employment. It's always open. We don't close that. So you could apply tonight when you go home, and you'll get a call tomorrow that we'd use your services this summer.
Okay, good to know. Thank you.
Sir?
Thank you. Drew Tholly, West Street. Question, I believe, for the state. You did a nice job articulating the plover arc of return and volume relative to the goals. I didn't see anything about the lease turn. And so my question is, I know that they're treated very differently in many regards. One is federally protected, one is by the state. What are the goalposts for getting the lease turn off of that concerned list?
That's a great question. And, one of the problems that we have with lease turns is they're really hard to count. So that's really precluded us from having a strong sense of even what our population size is. We think the population's doing fairly well now and has increased, but it's very volatile. It goes up and down and up and down. So they're very confusing species to manage, and we don't have a numerical abundance goal for delisting them for that reason. They're tricky to count. They do benefit from piping plover protection because they are overlapping. But what causes the big ups and downs in the population, it's hard to understand sometimes.
So
Yeah.
just to clarify, so there would be no way of producing a similar looking graph for lease turns, and both because they're not able to be counted, and do I understand also that there is no written or agreed upon benchmark?
So they're counted every year to the best of our abilities throughout the state. And so we do produce, we can produce graphs of their estimated abundance over time. But it's true that there is not a numerical threshold right now for delisting. They're not at the point yet where it would be considered because they're still pretty vulnerable and they're subject to what appears to be big ups and downs in the population.
Next question.
Yes, hi. My name is Christopher Alexander. I am a resident of Marshfield. First of all, I'd like to thank each and every panel for curing my naivete about what actually occurs. It was enlightening, and what I wonder, as I sat here listening, it seems like the measures and metrics of population and protection have been quite significant on Duxbury Beach, and perhaps a feasibility study could be done about just crossover 1, and maybe on the most northern point of crossover 1 after Blakeman's, perhaps create another crossover. Now, I understand the concern is money. I don't really understand the cost of the tokens. But being said, with the tools at your dispense for bird deterrence, for escorts, nest removal, if it was all consolidated into crossover 1, and perhaps with the added crossover at the most northern point, you would minimize road traffic. And I wouldn't say this is a short-term goal. It would probably have to be done over a period of years. But those deterrents would eventually, move the birds' migration to crossovers 2 and 3, and allow that one crossover to remain open for the residents. And again, without understanding the cost of the tokens, have you taken some of the funding received to hire a professional grant writer or a solicitor to go after some of these federal grants that are out there, using your success of measured in metrics of plover growth and protection as a benchmark of why you should get this grant money and these eligible funds. And then to the other point of volunteerism, I've run many successful organizations by using interns through colleges and high schools, offering scholarship opportunities, again, resume builders for these young students. I just believe you need to tap into civic duty, feasibility studies, grant writers, and use your success as a tool for getting these crossovers open. And I think ultimately the cost of the tokens would be less significant. You wouldn't be looking at the town wouldn't be looking at this study. And use your tokens wisely, but I would suggest using them down at crossover 2 and 3. Road access would no longer be your barrier.
Okay,
Just an opinion.
I'm going to try to parse that a little bit and put a little more narrow question to the Beach Reservation Society. Can you just do additional crossovers, and do you have the ability to find more money elsewhere?
I like to think we can always find more money through grants and anyone that wants to donate. And I'm sorry, that was pretty long, so I was trying to take notes and capture them. Are you suggesting that we make more crossovers, or we use the crossovers at Blakeman's? I didn't follow that part.
I think the suggestion was that you provide an additional crossover.
So I have to say that when you sit in the DBR offices and you look across at Duxbury Bay, you see a giant hole, and that's called crossover 2. And that's a conduit for wind and wave. And that is one of our more, if you look at the beach, the narrowest parts are always the most that you're worried about when it comes to overwash and breaches. And the other are kind of the man-made cuts we put in the dune. So maintaining the landform being our most important priority, we wouldn't be adding more crossovers. Using crossover 1, I don't think, and maybe I didn't understand, but I don't think that we could get a grant to put a listed species or push a listed species. But I'm all for trying anything that we can do, but I don't know if we could. It sounds like maybe your idea is to front-end load all of these tokens and usage, if you will, at crossover 1 and keep them open, and then kind of push the birds further south. Is that correct? I would have to ask the
I
state.
guess over a time period, but
Sure.
could there be a feasibility study done where, again, much of the problem as expressed in the PowerPoint was that the birds are crossing the roads and they're going to the bayside. And, you know, obviously they forage both at night and day and mostly during low tide. And I understand that part of it. But if it's crossing the road and it's always moving the crossover, like if you put it within 50 feet of one and then they hatch and then you have to go to 100 meters, and that keeps moving. But what I'm stating is if the crossover were at the northern point of crossover one, whether it's created or there's an old one by Blakeman's, I'm unaware of that, honestly. But if you could, by putting deterrence and using a token for deterrence, what you would minimize is the guided access. And then by slowly deterring them down to the other crossovers, and again, I don't know the complexities in it. It's just looking at it from a layman's perspective. Could not everybody enter as guided where those deterrents were? And over a time period, would that not work? And could those tokens be used more wisely in one affected area instead of trying to spread it out over 4.5 miles?
Totally understand.
More just a commentary, I don't know. But when I look at it from the explanation, it just seems like you've had great success in growing the population from the rest of Massachusetts. It seems like that's what's affecting the residents, affecting the sticker sales. And I just believe that, you know, if you have the right grant writers out there, their solicitations, they're paid when paid grant writers. So sometimes there's not upfront costs when you use them. And, you know, get that grant for the feasibility study and get those grants to utilize some of those tokens so it's not always, you know, tapping into the beach ball of the town residents or the town managers. There's federal funding out there available. You just need to know how to look for it.
All right, why don't we go to the next question? I'm sorry, I think the Carolyn wanted to respond to that.
Yeah, so that's an interesting idea. One of the challenges there is that if you were going to try to shift birds from a pretty substantial area and get them to move down the beach, the birds are going to have minimum territory sizes. They won't necessarily pack in how you want them to pack in because they're relying on a certain stretch of shoreline for their food, for themselves and for their chicks. They're territorial, so you can't necessarily get them to pack in. And then the other challenge is just from a regulatory perspective, the HCP has limits on acreage. So you couldn't impact enough acreage to make that feasible. We built in these acreage limitations to the HCP because what we didn't want to happen was for large birds to be displaced from certain sites and moved to other landowner sites where they become a problem for other landowners. So that's one of the reasons. And so there is a strict acreage limit for the HCP for deterrence.
Thank you. Ms. Sullivan?
Betsy Sullivan, Washington Street. There has been, over the years, community concern over the predator program. And I would like to know from the regulators, is this program mandated, or is it discretionary, and how is that managed?
We talked at length when we were developing the HCP with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, because the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had to approve the mitigation measures associated with the program. The only mitigation measure that they were willing to accept as mitigation for this program was predator control. So sometimes when we have a little bit, we sort of have met our mitigation requirements through predator control, we allow other types of mitigation, but they're not the primary sources of mitigation, and they're not accepted by the Fish and Wildlife Service. So we have to meet our mitigation requirements to the Fish and Wildlife Service with predator control. So Mass Wildlife, as the holder of the permit, is responsible for making sure that we've met our mitigation requirements with that predator control before we can do anything else. So each of our participants has to either be conducting predator control on site or providing funds for predator control elsewhere.
So it's not guided by the success of an individual program such as Duxbury. It's a statewide guideline?
Yep, it's statewide. So there was talk about whether or not mitigation could be tailored to the success of the birds at each individual site, but it presented sort of an unfairness issue because the management could be excellent and generally is excellent across the board, but each site is different and its capacity to feed plovers and capacity for success differs no matter how hard you try. Beaches are going to differ. So we really didn't want to penalize sites that had poor productivity despite all the effort they were putting forth. So it is a requirement across the board to provide mitigation regardless of how successful you are in producing plovers. And I'm going to pass this to David.
Thanks. So when we're talking with an applicant about an HCP, we're open to any type of mitigation. But mitigation has to offset the anticipated impacts to the population. So we would expect the mitigation to at least replace, or ideally would increase. There would be a net benefit to the species that's being affected. We spent a lot of time talking about this with Mass Wildlife. The number of options that were available for the proposed activities in the HCP area were limited. So other typical mitigation in other HCPs might be purchasing land and putting it in an easement. That's the availability of land in coastal Massachusetts and the cost of that. I mean, that we determined that wasn't feasible. Habitat restoration might be an option, but again, the amount of habitat that's available for restoration, we determined probably wouldn't meet the mitigation need entirely, and also would run into a lot of, correct me, Carolyn, but there's a lot of other permitting that would be needed for habitat restoration, habitat work on the coast. Things like education, increased law enforcement are really important for minimizing the impact on the species, but they aren't, we can't draw a direct connection to those and really offsetting the impacts of the take. And so we ended up on predator management, but it's not like that's the first thing on our list. We try to take an ecosystem approach, and so we don't, ideally we're not having to do predator management to benefit another species, but that was about the only option that we felt we were left with in this case.
Next question.
How you doing, everybody? My name is Tyler Kelly. I have a question for both the town and the DBR. I was looking at one of the graphics you had showing, all the regions that had to be met to get the plovers off the endangered species list. Quite frankly, it's not going to happen in our lifetimes, okay, if we're looking at all the different districts. So what we have to do now is look at the DBR in the town. You guys have discussed measures to mitigate closures. They all sound like great ideas, but what concrete action is going to be taken between now and April 1st when we can renew our beach permits? Because quite frankly, 8 weeks is unacceptable to be closed. So hopefully some concrete action is taken by you guys. Thank you.
Are there actions that are anticipated by either the town or the DBR in the near term relative to what next year looks like?
Yes, those were some of the items. Sorry, I don't know where that gentleman is. Those were some of the items we had discussed with the town and the regulators. I'm sorry to call you the R word all the time. One of them would be escorting, that the town and DBR have discussed at length. Escorting is the only permit that we currently don't have, and that would be driving through unfledged or chicks, plover chicks territory. And there's definitely positives to doing that. If we submit for it and we have a permit, we have it in case we're able to implement. There are some issues with that. Basically, our beach is so narrow that there's no place to escort to. The way that escorting works, and give me a leeway, I'm going to say it in one sentence, is you drive past a certain number of birds, you then drive past your buffer zone, and then you're able to park. The problem is on Duxbury Beach, we don't even have the buffer zone to drive past, never mind the place to park, because the birds are so spread out. But my thought is if we had the permit, at least if we had the opportunity, we might be able to implement. But I also think that you run into the false sense of telling people that we might be able to escort. And if we do get the permit for escorting, it's going to require a lot of work on the citizens' part. So you would have to watch a video, you would have to take a test, you'd have to sign your name and fingerprint and say that you've agreed to how the escorting works. The other piece that's a challenge, not only do we not have the area to escort to, is that you would have to tell folks that they can get on the beach at 8 a.m., I'm making this up, 8 a.m. and 1 p.m. And you can only get off the beach at 12 and 5. So that means that people would not be able to leave the beach whenever they wanted. And if they had a medical emergency, we would literally bring the ambulance to them. But yet the road would be open to Gurnett Saquish as essential vehicles. So everybody would be stuck on the beach for 4 hours and watch the road be used by dozens of cars. But they would be able to drive by, but everybody would be stuck on the beach until the opening to leaving time. So this is definitely an option. However, it does cost quite a bit of time and manpower. And that's something that the town and I are looking at. We could always put it in, and hopefully, we can't make the assumption that we would get the permit for it. But it also would cost mitigation. And how are we going to pay for that? Because as Carolyn mentioned, the different activities have different mitigation rates to them, and that is the highest rate. So it's definitely something that the town and the reservation have discussed.
Over to the right, please.
I got an answer too, Wayne.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thanks, Randy.
From the town standpoint, it's going to boil down to staffing. We can manage most of the beach much of the time with the staff we have now. If we decide to do something different, whether we go the escorting route or look at other options, it would mean an increase in staff. Now, again, it's seasonal staff, so that's good because that's a touch more economical than hiring year-round staff. It's attracting and retaining those people throughout the length of the summer that become the question. But since our budget process is still fairly early in its infancy, my answer is a touch squishy, but our answer right now would be to just look at if we could add to the staff to help out.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, so everyone would like a really short-term fix answer. My comment really doesn't address short-term, is more long-term.
Can I ask you to identify yourself and
what? Sure, sorry. I don't like public speaking, so I'm nervous. Suzanne McCourt, 3 Tinkers Ledge Road.
Thank you.
So earlier I found one of the slides that was put up interesting about the 4 regions that the chart with the piping plovers and how New England is doing far better than the other 3 regions. And maybe you could explain why that is. But doesn't, ultimately, to be able to avoid all these problems and limitations, all of the groups have to be doing well, because Massachusetts has, or New England has to be in line with the federal guidelines. So I understand that. Do we know why New England is doing so much better? Is there anything that has been done in New England that could be better implemented in these other areas? Because until they all even out, it doesn't matter how good New England does, it's still going to be impacted by the other regions. So that's much more long-term than short-term, but you have to start somewhere.
That seems like a question for the regulators.
Yes.
That's a great question, and we ask that question of ourselves all the time. Management is really good throughout the region, throughout the Atlantic Coast population. So I think there must be some things that are intrinsically different about the beaches and their abilities to support plovers that probably play into those differences you're seeing. The other thing that's really important about Massachusetts, and Massachusetts is really the driver of that trend in New England, because we have the most suitable habitat for plovers. So a lot of that trend's due to Massachusetts. We have a very, very strong Wetlands Protection Act in Massachusetts. So other states, while they're doing their best to protect the birds, they don't necessarily have the habitat protections at the strength that we have them here. And without a healthy habitat, your birds aren't going to do as well. So that interaction, I think, between the wetlands regulations and the endangered species regulations in Massachusetts probably has something to do with that as well. But I can't tell you with a lot of confidence, what is so different about the New England region compared to those other regions. I mean, it must be a combination of factors, but nobody's really figured it out yet. But thank you for the question.
Yeah, sure. I was just really curious because it's kind of the analogy of when you have a kid in school and they have to do a group project and they're the A student, but they're in with all the C students. They lose out because the other people don't do the work. So one quick comment for town in regard to volunteers. The high schoolers are always looking for volunteer opportunities for National Honor Society. So I bet you could probably, because those students need volunteer hours. So that might be another resource you could look into for help.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next question.
Hi, Dan Hebert, 296 Mayflower Street and Duxbury Animal Hospital. It's specifically about the evening hour access. I work 10 to 12-hour shifts, including the weekends, so I buy my sticker to use the beach from 7 to 11 p.m. And I talk to 20-plus Duxbury residents face-to-face every day, and I know I'm not alone. A lot of people enjoy that too, and that's been unavailable to us for years now. It's just been a pittance of days, a lot of times only till 10 p.m., not till 11. And it's regardless of whether the birds are there or not. So I know this doesn't really fall under the non-reimbursable thing, but I just want to know what happened to our evening access and whether somebody like me should continue spending money on getting a sticker.
Since you've taken over, that's what it's been. I don't have a great answer for that.
I guess that one goes to the town. Go ahead.
Yes, I get that. I've heard that a lot, and not the best answer in the world, but that's something 100% moving forward. We can look to going back to 11. We took over, 10 o'clock was the closure time. We haven't got off of that. I agree with what you're saying, and that's something we absolutely can look to push back to 11.
Thank you.
It's not just until 11. It's like both the 2 years that we've been allowed to be open, even just a few days on the weekends, it's only been after me or somebody else emails, and it's been no midweeks. It's just been a handful of days. It's not just until 11. It's how many days. We used to be able to go, you know, like the bench warmers people are correct. We used to love leaving work, not even going and showering, to go get a pizza and go spend a few hours at the beach fishing, looking through the telescope on a Wednesday night after a long day of work, when the last thing I want to do is go home. I want to go to the beach and relax. We had, how many days were we even open until 10 this year? Do we know? Was it more than 20?
Well, when the beach was open and oversand access was available, we were 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. was our time frame.
On Fridays and Saturdays?
Yes.
Okay. But, like I said,
But you're saying during the week?
Yeah, I mean, like, we used to be able to get out there all the time, and I was not alone out there in my truck. I mean,
Sure.
like, now it's 2 days a week. And I'm saying we're still paying. This has nothing to do with birds. The birds are gone. I can't get my money back on a sticker that I used twice this year, and it was during the day to get my dog out there after Labor Day.
Okay, let's go to the next question.
Drew Thawley, West Street again. Just
No,
maybe-
Drew, I think you've asked a question already. Okay. All right, go.
Thank you. This is to the DBR, I believe. Definitely disappointing to hear that the state doesn't seem to have benchmarks for lease turns that are measurable. To me, it seems that the plovers are not really our major issue here. They're earlier in the season. They're a little bit more sporadic. The lease turns have, I think, been responsible for closing us out of all of July, or most of July and all of August. If there's no benchmarks in place, and we're one of the leading sites in the state, I wonder if one of the initiatives that the DBR is exploring is to work with the state to get the lease turn removed from its status. We don't need to be at the complete mercy of an entity that we should have some influence over. So I'm curious about the DBR's perspective on that particular question. Thank you.
So I'm going through my book trying to find the dates, because there isn't a very large number of weeks that it's only lease turns and not plovers. And it has to do with that the first plover closes it, if you will, but the last plover is the one that opens it, meaning they're continuously nesting throughout the season. So it isn't like all the, this is not going to make any sense, so please correct me. It's not like all the plovers nest and hatch and fledge and then leave, and then the terns come in. They definitely overlap. So there isn't like a 3-week closure because of lease terns without any plovers on the beach. Does that make sense?
So there are plovers on the beach in August?
Yes.
Okay.
For your other question about lobbying, or is that the correct term? I certainly would work with Carolyn to look at numbers, but to be honest, there's only 2 full-time people at Duxbury Beach Reservation, so my focus really isn't trying to lobby against, with the state to delist a bird that's threatened.
It's not threatened.
Okay.
Let's go to the next question.
Yeah, I mean, I would. Yeah, please.
Let's go to the next question.
Carolyn has something she wanted.
Oh, Carolyn has an answer. Great.
I just wanted to add that anyone is able to propose a species for delisting or change in status or listing in Massachusetts. Nobody has proposed that for lease turn yet, but it is an option. We do take delisting proposals from the public if that's something that somebody wanted to look into in the future.
Hi, Devin Graham, Bay Road. I'm on the fence, one of the many probably that are on the fence about getting a sticker next year. And I was just curious how many days next year you anticipate that the beach is going to be closed.
Rainey, do you want to take that one?
No, I won't. I'll take it, but I'm going to qualify it. What I'm going to do is give you a touch of historical information. Again, remember, we're dealing with wild animals, so they're totally unpredictable, but I will give you this. So in 2022, we were closed for 53 days. In 21, we were closed for 46 days. And in 2020, we were closed for 36. And in 2019, we were closed for 29 days. There's a qualifier in there, though. Part of that was because of COVID, so that when the beach got closed, everything got closed, but then it was able to reopen. But those are the closing dates. Prior to that, we had had a closure in 2013, and that was for 31 days. In that other time frame between 2014 and 2018, we didn't close, but we had restrictions, so the linear footage was reduced, so the number of cars that could get out there was also reduced. Yeah, so when you're dealing with numbers from one year to the next going 29, 36, 46, 53 days, I'm not going to hedge my bets, but the trend line isn't going down. But what I will say is this, and this is something we've talked to the reservation about, and this is pretty important for anybody that likes to go out to the beach. The birds typically arrive in March or April, and the concept is to try and get out on the beach earlier. Now, I know March and April are not exactly wonderful beach times, but the more activity that occurs out there, the chances are you'll have fewer nests in what I would call the preferred recreational areas, i.e. crossover 1, 2, in between. So it can be... The challenge is, for anybody that goes out there, though, and that actually happened this year, is the sand can be really superfine sand. And as a result, you can get stuck, so you got to be very careful. But one of the things that we're considering doing, and I'm not saying this year or next, but eventually phasing out the use of all-wheel drive vehicles on the beach. Because if you tend to look at Facebook on occasion, like I am known to do myself, you'll see that very often people will ask the question, what kind of car should I buy if I want to go out to Duxbury Beach? Do I buy an all-wheel drive or a four-wheel drive vehicle? The overwhelming answer is a four-wheel drive vehicle. I have nothing against all-wheel drive vehicles, believe me. But that's what you tend to see not get stuck. Very often it's the all-wheel drive vehicles that get stuck out there. So eventually we'll probably see a phasing out of that. But the idea is to churn the place early. It doesn't mean, driving over the dunes in a dune buggy and chasing birds. It just means getting out there and being more active, walking up and down, park there and get out there. Steve and I were talking. We certainly have the staff to be able to handle that. It's very simple. But getting out there early would provide the chance of having the birds go elsewhere. Just a thought.
So less than 50 days?
I'm sorry?
Less than 50?
Boy, I'd love to tell you that. I don't have the answer. I'm sorry.
I believe the Carolyn would like to respond to that as well.
Yeah, so just to be clear, any activities that are directed towards deterring plovers would cost a token. You can't deter plovers from nesting without having a permit to cover it, because that's considered harassment and it's a take. So that's an activity. Deterrence is allowed under the HCP, but it has to be permitted.
Next question.
Hi, Ashley Maher, West Street. My question is more organizational for the DBR, but how is the board nominated, elected, and what is the term?
How's the board
nominated and
elected?
And what is the term?
Yeah. Yep, there you go. Thanks.
We have a nominating committee, and the nominating committee is led by Tim McChrystal, our secretary, and we have positions are nominated, and then the candidates are interviewed by the nominating committee and presented to the board for approval, and then they're elected by the trustees.
So is there an application process?
What?
Is there an application process?
Application process?
No.
So this,
I just wanted to, generally, trustees are nominated as a result of being very actively volunteering with the reservation prior to, having shown an interest and put in a lot of time in some of the events and activities.
so this community forum was scheduled to go 2.5 hours until 9 o'clock, although I understand that we have PAC TV beyond that. It does appear that we have a fair number of people who'd still like to ask questions. So I'd like to ask the panel if they would mind staying a little longer so that we could try to go through the rest of the questions. All right, so why don't we take the next question?
I'm Breyer, Toby Garden Street. Well, I'm referring to a chart on the Save Duxbury Beach historical total closures by town, well, it's by town department, according to here. And Renee went over the numbers well, I think. I guess my question is, there wasn't that significant an increase in number of nesting birds until this past year. But there's certainly been, as he said, we didn't start really having beach closures until 2019. Again, COVID, I think, was part of that. And then, well, I guess in 2020. Prior to that, we only had 1 year, 2013, with 31. Was there something, I'm just asking you, was there something that changed that increased significantly, actually from 0 to 29, 36, 46, and 53 consecutively, that changed to cause that increase?
Yeah. I'm going to answer your question, but it's a good question. I want to back up, though. I am not condoning that you all run out there in March and April and start chasing birds around. I want to make clear that, and I did not mean to convey that, but it's just a matter of activity, movement, things like that. Don't let your dogs up in the dunes still. The question is best answered this way. While we didn't have closures, we had very intense restrictions. We were this close to closing in many cases. Like I said, we were down to 30 cars. And we were getting a lot of heat in 14, 15, and 16, actually all those years, I'll be honest with you, because people were saying, my God, when are they going to open the beach back up to have greater capacity? Because that's when we were starting to see people stacking across the bridge. The cars were just lining up, and they were showing up at 7 a.m., folks coming in from Framingham or other faraway places, trying to get out there early so they could go out there for the day, particularly in the weekends, and in the summer during the weekdays. So while we didn't have closures per se, we did have very intense restrictions. What happened? The number of birds increased, and as you've heard, it doesn't take many of them to close an entire area down. So, fate. Again, we're dealing with wild animals, and they decide to land where they do, and that can be it for a while.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Sure. We'll go this side again.
Sorry, me, Kim, Glass Terrace. Do the DBR and the town have any plans on doing anything different for this upcoming year, such as, deterring nesting in certain areas?
You all saw me shoot myself in the foot about 10 minutes ago when I said run out there. Yeah, that, let that stand there for a minute. Chris mentioned right out of the gate something that we had talked about just a couple weeks ago, which isn't so much a deterrent as it's a means of increasing access. I've fished out there for years. I'm more of a fishing guy, and I like the Bayside personally because there's a beautiful channel that runs along the back road. And when she mentioned the discussion that we had about opening the turnouts there, that was because I was kind of an advocate for that, and I know that they've been closed a little bit here and there. So we're going to try and reopen that. So again, it's not really a deterrent, it's trying to figure out ways of getting more access, and that's one vantage point. In terms of deterring, that's a DBR question.
So in the past, there's been a lot of different divisions with the town that have managed beach ops, and we're really excited that it landed in the rec department. And Steve and my colleague Bradford and I have met. It really needs to be a decision of the town to decide where they want to spend their tokens. If you spend them on deterrence early in the season and then birds cross the road, you will run out of deterrence and the beach will close. I don't mean off-road driving beach, I mean the entire beach. Like you drive over the bridge and you won't be able to turn around because you'd be on our property. So that really needs to be a conversation where the town actively works in making those decisions of what's most important and where to spend those tokens.
Thank you.
Anthony Abaya, Plantation Drive. Actually, I'd like to follow up just to clarify that comment. So if you exceed your tokens, you have to close down the beach. That is a state mandated thing. The beach is closed if you exceed the 12 that was submitted in the HCP 2 years ago?
We would have to close it to driving. People could certainly walk to the beach, but you wouldn't be able to drive through our parking lots or down the back road if you're a recreational vehicle.
Although the HCP includes the full beach expanse. And so as I read through the HCP, it goes from the Blakemans through that third crossover, and it sort of talks about that full frontage of beach. And so what would be the reason that only the Oversand recreational, it didn't seem to be carved out as an exclusion in that? Why would that be the only thing that would be limited? I had understood you saying earlier the beach would not be available to anybody, including walk-on.
So I'm sorry, I'm happy to answer. I didn't follow you a little bit. So the OSV is closed when the access basically is closed, the crossovers. So if we have to put out, if that fencing goes in front of a crossover, that's what closes the OSV.
Yeah, the question was actually different. So when you exceed 12, what exactly is closed?
When I exceed 12, our entire property is closed.
For walk-on in all use?
For driving. No cars would be allowed in our recreational vehicles would be allowed on our property. And that would be anything south of Blakemans, because as I said, north of Blakemans, it isn't habitat, because across the road is a salt marsh.
And that's dictated by the state and the conditions of our HCP?
That's part of the permit. It allows us to drive, one of those covered activities is driving through parking lots and roads through priority habitat. The permit allows us to drive through there, and we mitigate for as many tokens as we can. And we have 12 tokens that allows us to then determine where we're going to best spend those tokens.
Yeah, thank you, and that's super helpful. I'm by no means an expert on the legalese around this phrasing, but I think what's challenging in the HCP application is hugely insightful, and encourage reading it. I just started to, and it's great. But what I struggled with is this distinction between limiting the oversand when the actual application and the idea of 12 tokens seemed to be an entire beach use. And I didn't see that it was specifically saying you can only do one thing when the predation is actually the driver of the plovers and a lot of that loss, not oversand driving.
So the tokens do work for the entire beach.
Okay.
So if we have a crossover that we close, I showed a barrier so the bird doesn't, that spends a token. So we don't want that bird to come through the main pedestrian pathway. It'll be in the parking lot, and that would be very bad. So when we put a token, we spend a token there. We already know on average 10 birds cross the road. That could be north or south of the bridge. So 10 tokens are already kind of used on average, and that's an average, so we have more that have crossed the road, but in the last 5 years, it's an average of 10. So those tokens are used throughout the beach. If we reduce our fencing, if we open crossover 1, and remember the slide that said the nest was in 23 meters of the crossover, that cost us a token. So every time we do any of those activities to keep the beach open, it costs us a token, as well as if birds cross the road. Those will cost tokens as well. So it isn't just focused on OSV. That's why I'm saying the entire beach has 12 tokens. That's why the reservation is going to work with the town, so the town has a little bit of ownership of where they best want to use those tokens as well.
Okay. And thank you, everybody, for the information tonight. Really helpful.
Next question.
Hello, name's Steve White from Lakeville, Mass. The reservation keeps speaking of mitigation and highest rate of mitigation. What is the actual rate, highest rate of mitigation, and what do you do to offset this rate with all the monies that are brought into the beach by the different communities and different users of the beach and by ticket sales? So what is the actual highest rate of mitigation?
So what is the reservation spending on the beach?
No,
So,
you keep speaking of mitigation.
Yes.
And if you do this, this is the highest rate of mitigation. What is the rate? What is the actual number? And how is it offset? Or how can we offset it?
$6,150 per token, but it depends on the activity. If it's 3-to-1 mitigation versus 2.5-to-1 mitigation. The reservation pays for all of the tokens through the work that we do. So there's different types of mitigation that you can do. We have predator management, it's a requirement. We have education on the beach. We pay Mass Audubon to give free classes. And we pay into the fund in order to have those tokens. Does that make sense? So on average, it's about $368,000 a year that the reservation pays for the coastal ecology program.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Next question.
Hi, I'm Heather Canty from Summer Street. My question goes back to a slide that the woman from the state put up. Thank you. That the woman from the state put up. You had the 4 where we are showing that we're exceeding our plover level, but that nobody else is. And maybe this would go to the federal person, but you weren't here at the time. You have Eastern Canada on there. So how do we control what Canada does? And I'm just wondering how that is part of our problem. How are their lower levels our problem? How do we work with that?
It's a pretty delicate issue telling another country what to do. Usually involves our headquarters office. Considering the birds that are in Canada is part of the listed entity. So the Atlantic seaboard isn't the only place that piping plovers occur, but in the Endangered Species Act, it's listed as the Atlantic coast piping plover. So all of the whole population, all the states where they occur, provinces where they occur, they're all included in that listed entity. And so we have a lot of difficulty in, as you're finding out, and other folks in Massachusetts are finding out, that the wonderful job that the state and the beach managers are doing for the species is a blessing for the species. On another hand, it can be a curse. We have a lot of difficulty implementing local measures that may affect the species differently, because it's not, in most cases, it's not legal to treat the species differently as a blanket. Like in all of Massachusetts, we can't just say like we're going to treat plovers differently because they're doing so well. We are trying to explore with the state with species experts from our regional office, with our attorneys to find out what's legal, to see if there are, like, what sort of flexibilities there are that we can explore, because it's, I mean, it's the whole state. There's a lot of folks that are getting squeezed by the piping plover population. So we're doing what we can, but and exploring every option. But we do need to consider the species across its whole listed range.
Okay, so just so I can understand, as long as the plovers are low in Georgia and in North Carolina, it affects Massachusetts. So basically what you're saying is we're never gonna, no matter what we do, they're always going, even if we're way up here, they're always gonna be a problem for us, as long as everybody else doesn't do their job. Is that what you're saying? So we're gonna continue to do it and do it and do it and watch our number go off the chart. They're always going to be threatened, even though they're not threatened here.
I hope that that's not the case, that they're always going to be threatened.
Well, from the charts that she showed us, that's exactly what's happening. Like, it doesn't seem that those other 4 areas are doing their job. We are in New England, but the others aren't. So I guess what I'm saying is, will they ever not be threatened? That's my question.
It's a tough one for me to answer.
What's to keep us to keep doing it? That's what I'm saying. If nobody else is doing their job, I just don't understand why, if Massachusetts and New England is doing it, why do we still have to follow? Why aren't Georgia and those guys doing it? Do you know what I'm saying? It just doesn't seem to, I don't understand why they remain threatened here if they're not threatened here. They're threatened there.
I understand what you're saying. Our options under the Endangered Species Act are limited to consider local conditions.
So basically, there's our answer.
Next question.
Thank you. My name is John Day. I live on Depot Street. And this question is directed to all 3 tables. Have any of your organizations done any sort of assessment of the economic damage to our local businesses caused by these extensive closures all summer?
I'll go.
So I can speak for Duxbury Beach Reservation. No, we haven't done an assessment of revenues of third parties in the town. Our focus, as I said, is to maintain the barrier beach, to protect the town. But so we're not investigating other people's businesses.
And the town?
Oh, yeah. Hi, John. We haven't done it with respect to the businesses, but we do, of course, do it with respect to the town, and in many cases you can take that information and transpose it into what might be an economic scenario for many of those businesses. Now, our figures are going to be different in terms of the percentage and decrease, but our trend line, and this was information that was presented to the Board of Selectmen and the Finance Committee and the Fiscal Advisory Committee a couple months ago during our budget presentation. John Adams, our Finance Director, put it together. He was saying that we were noticing for the years preceding FY21, we didn't have an accurate cost center for beach expenditures, but in the chart that he had provided at that time, which you can see on the town's website under the Finance Director's page, he assumed a linear projection of costs decreasing at 2.5% each year from 2021 to 2025, excuse me. And the trend line was decreasing at a rate of $83,300 per year. And the last time, he also noted that the last time that we had an increase in the beach sticker was 2019. So we have noticed it going down, absolutely. We find ourselves at a point of intersect where the cost, the revenues coming in are going down while the cost of operations are going up. We have reached that point of intersection this year and probably last year, and we will definitely feel it next year. But in terms of a real percentage to the local businesses, I can't give you that, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Because I don't have it, not because I don't want to.
Understood. And the regulators, are there any sort of provisions in the other federal or state regulations that balance economic impact to businesses and people against wildlife management or wildlife protection?
One of the things that we're trying to do with the HCP is to bring some balance. It's not an expansive program, but it is bringing some relief to beaches and hopefully business owners as well, relative to not having the HCP at all.
Understood. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Michael Wood from Starboard Way. Just to back to the woman that was up here before me, I think what she was saying, and tell me if I'm right or wrong, is that if there was no plovers on the beach, we're very unsuccessful, the beach is wide open? Is that right? Let's just say yes. And if we're highly successful, we got thousands of plovers, the beach is shut down forever? Is that right? I'm asking you right now. Are you asking me? If we had thousands and thousands of plovers on the beach, would the beach be shut down? The answer is yes. So
I think you're talking about vehicle access specifically.
Of
So
course. Yep.
the presence of plovers definitely changes things as far as vehicle access, but pedestrian access is
right. But that's what I'm referring to.
primarily
So
compatible.
the more successful we are at raising these birds, the less successful we are at using the beach. I think most people in this room want to save the birds. I don't know, I think everyone does. I don't think there's one person in here that doesn't want to save the birds. But there's certainly people in this room that don't want people using the beach. We know that. What I would like to do, if I could, is propose this. The secretary that's choosing the board, if tomorrow we reached out and you could let us know exactly that process for the last few years, who's been up for a bid, how it's been processed, who's been elected to the board, so that we can figure that out for the next few years. Because one of the problems that this room's having is that we have birds that we want to save and a beach we want to use, and we sit here for 2 hours and we don't want to talk about the big bird in the room, which is there's some people in this room that doesn't want that to be the case. Some people would love it to be thousands of birds and no trucks on the beach. Does that make sense?
All right, sir, is there a question?
Yeah, could we figure out tomorrow, could we reach into the group and figure out what is the actual process? The secretary, supposedly the secretary is choosing the board. How is she doing that? What is the process? So we could figure out how, if we could change that in the future or get someone on the board.
Let me help you with that. The Duxbury Beach Reservation is a private entity, and they get to regulate their own membership.
So what's the answer? So the answer is no, or?
I don't know how much more direct I can be. You're talking about a private entity that gets to regulate its own membership. You cannot dictate who's going to run Google. That's not what happens in this country. Next question.
Thank you.
Hi, Colleen Breyer, Toby Garden Street. The HCP program seems more restrictive than what we had in the past. It seemed like if we didn't when we didn't have the HCP, the only reason we would end up closing the beach is if we had killed a bird. And now it seems, can we not open the beach if we don't have the HCP? I'm just confused. In the past, because we are doing such a great job monitoring our birds, babysitting the birds, and so I know that have always been considered someone to look to how to run the beach and keep the plovers on the beach and let people use the beach. And now with this HCP, it seems like we're going a little bit backwards for us because, again, we're doing such a great job. It seems more restrictive. Would we be able to open the beach if we didn't have the HCP? And if we didn't have the HCP, how would things look?
That's a great question, and I don't want to misspeak, so Chris, please correct me if I've gotten any history wrong. But in the old days, when there were fewer birds on Duxbury Beach, and there were fewer, there were also, the birds really weren't crossing. And we thought that the dune system was a barrier to them crossing. But under the guidelines, if there's a barrier to them crossing, a natural barrier, then you can drive past because they can't get from the ocean side to the bay side if there's a barrier. But over the years, what happened was that we found that that barrier was permeable, and there really wasn't an avenue to allowing recreational use in that kind of situation. And the HCP was developed in part for situations like Duxbury Beach had, to allow that recreational access when the guidelines would have prohibited it. So the HCP is currently providing Duxbury Beach Reservation with some assurances that they won't be liable if a take occurs, now that we know that that is a permeable barrier. And there is an option now for them to have that assurance that they won't be liable.
Oh, one other thing I wanted to, it's not Blakeman's. Blakeman's is the restaurant at Duxbury Beach Park, and I'm saying this because it's going out on the TV. And if anybody is looking to find out how to get to the beach in Duxbury, not from Duxbury, it's Duxbury Beach Park. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question.
My name is Brian O'Sullivan. I live at 600 Summer Street. My question is for the town manager. Your opening statement, you stated that you were here to continually get us to purchase the oversand vehicle stickers. My question to you is, why? Why would anybody, knowing what's going to happen next year, willingly purchase a sticker? No other aspect in our lives would we accept paying for something and not getting what we're paying for. I don't know why Duxbury Beach is any different. And the fact, I want my 53 days back. I want it back next year. And it should be prorated. Because buying something and not getting it is ridiculous. And the fact that the town of Duxbury, in good conscience, continues to sell stickers knowing that the beach is closed should be criminal. It needs to stop. If the beach is closed June 8th, ticket sales need to be stopped selling June 9th, and then start again when they open up. It's the internet world. It can be done. But the money's still flowing in, knowing that they're not going to use the beach. It's criminal, and it needs to stop. Thank you.
If we could get a question.
Sure. I keep getting up, sitting down because you keep answering questions, and it's leading to more questions. So thank you. My last one. Per page 49 of your certificate of inclusion, you mentioned deterrence can be utilized in order to have some oversand access remain open for recreational use. If deterrence were placed on a crossover before April 1st, would that count as a take?
Can we do that a little slower?
Sure. And page 49 of your certificate of inclusion, you mentioned you can put deterrence out before April 1st. Is that considered a take, putting a deterrent? Do you not understand the question? It's on your COI on page 49. Yes.
Memorized by page.
It says that you will place deterrence out before April 1st. I'm asking, is that considered a take?
Oh, deterrence. I'm sorry.
Yes.
I thought you were saying place turns.
No,
That
sorry.
was the problem.
Deterrence. Sorry.
So it says we can place
Yes.
deterrence out, yes?
It does say that in your COI on page 49.
Yes, I'm agreeing with you.
Yes. So is that considered a take?
Yes.
It is a take.
Right, that's why I'm like, if we put deterrence out, we first have to determine how many birds were there in the past, the last year, and then we would blow 2 tokens. The problem is it's in the very beginning of the season.
Why 2?
Because for my example, there were 2 birds nesting there, and you want to deter them so you can keep the crossover open. So you start from 50 meters from the crossover and then go, well, it could be 200, it could be 100. How far do you want to deter them? And in the example I gave, we were deterring them for the whole 200 meters. If we did that, then we would have to figure out how many birds nested there that we were actually deterring from the past year. So it would automatically take 2 or 3, depending on how many birds nested in that area, from the 12 tokens that we have to use.
Okay. That's my question. Thank you.
So I'm giving the 10-minute warning. So we have 10 more minutes, and so if anybody feels like they want to ask a question, let's do it for the next 10 minutes.
Hi, my name is Pam White. I'm from Pembroke, and this is directed to the town. Is there any consideration for reducing the cost of the beach sticker, seeing as we're not getting its full value?
The direct answer is not yet. We're still looking at different models for not just sticker sales, but also possible revenue sharing. It's something we just started talking about in the last couple of weeks. I know the sticker sale, the sticker price is high, considering with the number of days of closure. So we're trying to figure out, do we go with an annual sticker like we have now? Do we go with a seasonal 12-week? Do we do a weekly? Do we do a daily? Do we do a 3-day, Friday, Saturday, Sunday? Those are all things that we have to consider because we've still got to pay for a lease and figure out how to cover our costs. So to change that model would significantly impact the town's ability to pay the lease because the dollar amount would definitely decrease. So I don't have a better answer than that other than to say we're looking at all the options right now to try and figure out what the best bet might be. You may see an annual sticker again next year. It may just wind up being that, but it's something that we're having active discussions about now.
Again, to Brian's point, you want to, we didn't get 53 days worth of beach time. So, thank you.
Thank you. Over here.
Chrissy Antonellis-Resendez on Lincoln Street. So according to the report that went to the state, that takes that are unused carry over. In 2021, only 6 takes were used, allowing that for 6 takes to be carried over. So this year, 10 to 12 were used. That allowed for 20 takes in 2023. Based on this, why are we jumping to the conclusion that we'll run out of takes, knowing that on average we use 8, and then we have 20 for the next year?
Those take exposures don't carry over in the way that you're thinking. So what carries over is the mitigation that you would pay. If you don't use your take exposures, you can carry your mitigation over, but you can't save up unused take exposures from one year and use them in another year.
So hypothetically, the deterrence you did in 2022 could carry over and you wouldn't have to use that token again to do the same thing?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Sorry, I'm trying to wrap my head around it, but
it's all the jargon.
Yeah, so basically, if you put a deterrent up in 2022 and you used a token for that, for whatever it was, you don't have to use that token again to do the same thing in 2023. So something that was already a deterrent in some place is the same deterrent next year?
Oh, it wouldn't have a carryover effect like that. You'd have to do it each year if you wanted to do it. So I guess to simplify it, for Duxbury Beach, they have 12 tokens in each year. If they use 0 tokens in one year, it doesn't mean they have 24 tokens in the next year. They only have 12.
So what carries over in that report?
So the mitigation that they pay. So if they don't affect any pairs in one year, they don't pay any mitigation. Sorry, that's not quite right. So they have to provide mitigation up front before the start of implementation. But if they don't impact any of those pairs, that mitigation will roll over to the next year. So the mitigation rolls over.
So like that $6,000 she was saying hypothetically would roll over to the next year.
Yeah, so let's just say it's a 3-year permit, and let's just say they have 1 token. They only have a permit for 1 token. So before they implement in year 1, they have provided $6,000, but then they wind up not implementing. They don't have to provide $6,000 in year 2 because they haven't implemented in year 1, but they provided those funds. If they implement in year 2, then they would have to provide another $6,000 going into year 3.
Okay, so it's a money saving factor. Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Sir?
Thanks, Mr. Dennison. Benjamin Cronin, Pill Hill Lane. I just had three quick factual questions, and I think I'll just do them and I get the answers, then go. The first is, so the take or the token for the analogy is, just to clarify in the slide, is that established in the statute themselves, the U.S. Endangered Species Act and the Mass Endangered Species Act, or is it in the regulations there too, or pursuant thereto, or where is it exactly established? I guess that would be for the regulatory authorities.
Sorry, I'm not sure I'm understanding your
Sure,
question.
Sure. So the take, that is in the language of the statute, or is it in the regulations, or is it in both?
Oh, okay. Yeah, so take is defined in the statutes.
Okay.
But take exposures is a phrase that we're using specific to the HCP.
Okay. The second question is, so if we talk about another species, not the ones in question here, if we talk about the gray wolf and it's doing very well in Montana and poorly in Michigan, does it have the same metrics of being listed under the statute as these animals or other species, not just animals?
The definition of take is applied the same to any listed species.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. And then the final one would be, so if we were to want to change these, that would require an act of Congress or the Mass Legislature, essentially, would be my understanding. Is that correct?
Take is defined in the Endangered Species Act, so that's something that Congress changes. If it was just something that was in the regulations, that's something that the Fish and Wildlife Service could alter.
Okay. Thanks very much.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question.
Oh, sorry. So if in year one you put up a deterrent, the previous year, 2 pairs were, I guess, affected by this deterrent. So you successfully deterred them. The following year, does that take tokens to do the same thing? Even though you successfully prevented it from last time, so that this time there's no effect on any of the birds, because the previous year they weren't there. So is any deterrent going to cost a token, or only if it affects a bird?
So if you start to deter, then it costs a token, even if you're not successful, because you've harassed the birds in the meantime. So that's one of the reasons why deterrents are kind of a risky proposition, because you can harass and harass and harass the birds, and only about 50% of the time will you be effective, to date with the methods people have used. So it's a consideration for our participants, including the reservation, whether or not they want to use a take exposure or token on deterrence when the guarantee that it will work isn't 100%.
If it does work, in the following year, can you use that same thing, and is that considered a take because you were successful the last year and there were no birds there?
So the following year, most likely the birds will be right back
But if they
where
weren't,
you
though,
deterred
were
them
successful.
before.
Right, but you were successful at deterring. So the following year, is that considered another take? Because there were none the year before.
If you deter them again, it would be considered a take exposure again. Yeah.
But there were none the previous year. You were successful in deterring them the year before.
Oh, yeah, so Chris actually misspoke a bit about, what we, how we calculate the number. It wouldn't be just based on the previous year. It would be based on what they've been doing over the years in that spot. It wouldn't just be based on one year. Yeah.
So one of the nicest parts of this community is its ability to come together and face, at times, difficult questions with cordial and collegial people. I want to thank everybody who came out tonight. I want to thank everybody who participated in the panels. I think multiple people have provided email addresses for follow-up. But thank you all for this community forum.